Chapter 1. How I Met My Convict. My father's family name was Pirrup, and my parents named me Philip. When I was very young, I couldn't say my name properly. I said it was Pip, so that's what people called me. I don't remember my father or my mother. They both died when I was a baby. They are buried in the churchyard along with my 5 brothers, who all died before I knew them. The only one who lived was my sister, who was more than 20 years older than me. She married the blacksmith, Joe Gargery, and I lived with Mr. and Mrs. Joe Gargery near the marshes beside the river. There were not many trees, and it was always cold, wet, and windy. Late one afternoon, when it was colder, wetter, and windier than usual, I was at the churchyard looking at the graves of my family. There was Philip Pirrup and Georgiana, the wife of the above. There was also Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the above. Weeds grew around the graves. I looked at the marshes and toward the river. The sea was 20 miles away, but the cold wind came from there. I shivered. A terrible voice behind me said, "Come here. Don't make a noise, or I will cut your throat." I didn't make a noise as a frightening man dressed in gray clothes came toward me from the graves near the church. He had an iron ring on his leg. His shoes were worn out. He had no hat. Instead, he wore a rag on his head. His clothes were wet and muddy, and there were scratches and cuts on his hands and face. He nodded and shivered. His eyes were red. Coming close, he took hold of me by the chin. "Please, don't cut my throat," I cried. "Please don't." He growled. "What's your name?" I replied, "Pip, sir." "Where do you live?" I pointed to the village, about a mile away. The man looked at me. Then he turned me upside down and shook me to empty my pockets. All I had was a small piece of old bread. He snatched it up and ate it. He seemed very hungry. "I could eat you," he growled, looking at me again exactly as if he might. I begged him not to eat me. He asked, "Where's your mother?" "There, sir." I pointed to the grave. "Georgiana, that's my mother." "Is that your father next to her?" I nodded. "Who do you live with?" "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, the blacksmith's wife." He looked at the iron ring on his leg and grunted. "Blacksmith, eh?" He took hold of both my arms and put his face close to mine, looking into my eyes. "You get me a file and some food. Bring them to me here tomorrow, or I will cut your heart out. And don't tell anyone that you saw me. I have a young friend hiding with me. He loves to cut open small boys and take their hearts. I am stopping him now, but he would love to get your heart." I promised to get what he wanted. He let me go, and I went toward home. I looked back to see him limping into the marshes. I looked for the other young man he had mentioned, but I couldn't see him. I ran home without stopping. My sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, the blacksmith's wife, had strong hands, and she used them to hit me and her husband quite often. When I got home that afternoon, Joe warned me that Mrs. Joe was out looking for me. "She has the tickler with her," he added. The tickler was a stick that she used to hit us if she thought her hand was not enough. I hid behind the door, but she found me there soon enough. She hit me and then threw me at her husband. "Where have you been?" she shouted. "Only at the churchyard," I said, crying. "The churchyard? If I hadn't looked after you, you would have stayed there for a long time. I don't know why I brought you up. It's bad enough being a blacksmith's wife without being your mother. I'll end up in the churchyard myself one day. Then what will you do?" That evening, we had a piece of bread for tea. I put mine in my pocket. Joe thought that I had eaten it very quickly. Mrs. Joe complained that I should not eat so quickly. She gave me a long drink of tar water to cure me. Tar water tasted very bad and did no good, but she often made me drink it as if it was a punishment. She made Joe drink some too. It was Christmas Eve and I had to do some small jobs in the kitchen. I hid my piece of bread in my room. Just before going to bed, I heard a gunshot. Joe explained that a convict had escaped, and the police fired the gun to warn everybody. I asked some more questions, but Mrs. Joe was annoyed. She yelled, "You ask too many questions, boy." Joe asked, "Didn't you hear the gunshot last night? One escaped then, and now another one has escaped." I asked, "Where did they escape from?" Mrs. Joe replied, "Did I bring you up just so that you could worry me to death with questions? They escaped from the hulks." Mrs. Joe was very annoyed, so I had to ask carefully. But I found out that hulks were prison ships and that people were put there for murdering and stealing. Then she sent me to bed. Lying in bed, I thought about the hulks. That's where I would be one day, I thought. I was asking too many questions, and in the morning, I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. I was very frightened, and I did not sleep very well that night. I got up very early the next morning and went to the pantry while Joe and Mrs. Joe were still sleeping. It was still dark. I stole some bread, a piece of cheese, and some cooked meat. I poured some brandy from the stone bottle into a smaller bottle and then replaced the brandy with some water from a jug in the kitchen. I found a pork pie and took that too. Then I got a file from Joe's box of tools. I took it all with me and ran to the churchyard. It was wet and cold that morning. It was difficult to see anything in the mist that lay on the ground. Suddenly, I saw a man sitting near the river and thought it was the man I had seen the day before. It wasn't, but he was very similar to him. He had the same clothes and the same iron ring on his leg, but he had a different face. The man by the river saw me and tried to hit me before he ran away. I thought it must be the young man who liked cutting boys open and taking their hearts. At the churchyard, the man whom I had met the day before was waiting for me. He looked very sick and ate the food quickly. Then he drank the brandy. He ate and drank like a dog, looking around him all the time. I asked him, "Aren't you leaving any for your friend?" "Who? No, he doesn't need any food." "He looked as if he did." When I told him about the other man I saw, he was very surprised. He asked, "Did he have a mark on the left side of his face?" He did, and I told him so. Excitedly, he said, "Where is he? I'll catch him." I showed him which way the man by the river had run, and he began to file at the iron ring on his leg. I said goodbye to him, but he didn't notice, and I went back home. Chapter 2. Christmas Dinner at the Blacksmith's Home. I expected to find a police officer in the kitchen, waiting to take me to the hulks. However, Mrs. Joe was very busy preparing for the Christmas dinner, and my crime had not been detected yet. "Where have you been?" asked Mrs. Joe. I said I had been to hear the carols. "I wish I could go to hear the carols," she said angrily. She told me to clean the floor. My sister had the rare talent of making a clean house feel more uncomfortable than a dirty house. She sent Joe and me to church for the Christmas service. My clothes were very uncomfortable, but I was even more uncomfortable in my soul. I was terrified of the young man who might still find me and cut out my heart, and I was terrified that my crime would be detected and that the police would send me to the hulks. We had some guests to dine with us for Christmas. They were Mr. Wopsle, the church clerk, Mr. Hubble the wheelwright, and his wife, and Uncle Pumblechook, who had a shop in the town. Uncle Pumblechook brought 2 bottles of wine and gave them to Mrs. Joe as he did every Christmas. I never enjoyed the Christmas dinner. Every Christmas, it was the same. This year, it was even worse. I had to sit at a corner of the table and was not allowed to speak, and I was only given all the worst bits of food. Worse than all of this, however, was the fact that everyone at the table always talked about me or constantly reminded me to be thankful. Everyone at the table complained about children and their bad behavior, and they told me how lucky I was to have a sister like Mrs. Joe. Mrs. Joe told them about all my illnesses that caused her so much trouble. He'd have been dead and buried long ago if I had not looked after him, she boasted. I hope he is thankful, said Uncle Pumblechook. Mrs. Joe offered him some brandy. The terror inside me suddenly swelled. I was sure that he would discover that I had put water in the brandy. I held on to the leg of the table as I watched him. Uncle Pumblechook picked up the glass and looked at the brandy. Then he threw his head back and drank all the brandy at once. The next instant, he jumped up, turned around several times, gave a shout, and began coughing. He ran to the door and went outside. I was sure that I had murdered him somehow. When he finally came back into the house alive, I was very pleased. He announced in a very unpleasant tone, "Tar!" His face was red and tears came from his eyes. I realized that I had accidentally put tar water in the brandy. My sister exclaimed with surprise, "How could there be tar in the brandy?" Uncle Pumblechook wanted some gin, so Mrs. Joe hurried to the kitchen to get some. Then Mrs. Joe ordered clean plates for the pork pie. I knew that my crime would be discovered now as Mrs. Joe went out to get the pie from the pantry. Joe whispered to me, "You shall have some, Pip." Joe's kind offer was lost on me. I was too busy imagining how Mrs. Joe would kill me for taking the pie. When I couldn't take it another moment, I jumped off my chair and ran for the door. I opened it and found to my surprise a group of soldiers there. One of them held out a pair of handcuffs to me. I ran back to the kitchen, forgetting to close the door behind me. At that moment, Mrs. Joe was coming back from the pantry. "What's happened to the pie?" she asked. Before anyone could answer, the soldiers came in and everybody stood up. The sergeant spoke. "I am chasing some convicts," he said. "I need the blacksmith to fix these handcuffs." The sergeant held them out in front of him. Joe looked at the handcuffs and told him it would take about 2 hours to fix them. I began to feel better when I realized that the handcuffs were not for me. "We are looking for 2 convicts," repeated the sergeant. "Has anyone here seen them?" All of the guests said they hadn't. I didn't say anything, but nobody noticed. While we all watched Joe working on the handcuffs, the soldiers and the other guests drank 2 bottles of wine. They even gave some to me. When Joe had finished with the handcuffs, he suggested that some of us should go with the soldiers to see if we could be of any help. Uncle Pumblechook and Mr. Hubble decided to stay in the house, but Mr. Wopsle said he would go with Joe and the soldiers, and Mrs. Joe agreed that I could go too. She told Joe, "If he gets his head blown off by a gun, don't ask me to fix him." As we set out for the marshes, the sergeant told us to stay behind the soldiers. "I hope they don't catch them," I whispered to Joe. "So do I," he whispered back to me. I realized that if we found them, my friend might think I helped the soldiers to find him. Then the young man would take my heart for sure. The wind was very cold that Christmas afternoon, and to make matters worse, it began to rain. Joe picked me up and carried me on his shoulders. We walked through the marshes, but we could not see any convicts. Then we heard a long, loud shout. As the soldiers moved toward the noise, there was more shouting. A voice cried, "Murder!" Another voice cried, "Escaped convicts!" We found the 2 convicts rolling on the wet ground, shouting and fighting. The soldiers pulled them apart. Both of them were bleeding. "Remember," said the convict whom I had helped. "I caught him. Remember that." "It won't do you any good," said the sergeant. He laughed and told the sergeant, "It is doing me good already. I caught him. He knows it. That is enough for me." The other convict protested. "He tried to murder me." "I don't want to murder you," said my convict. "I can make you suffer much more by putting you back in the hulks. Why should I murder you?" "He tried to murder me," repeated the other convict. "He's a liar," said the first convict. "He was a liar when we were tried together, and he is still a liar now." The two men tried to hit each other again, but the soldiers held them apart. Then the convict who had eaten the food I had stolen saw me. I shook my head and moved my hands, trying to tell him that I had not brought the soldiers to find him. The soldiers put handcuffs on both convicts and made them walk to the river. We went with them. When we reached a small wooden hut with a jetty into the river and a boat tied up, the soldiers put the second convict on the boat and took him to the hulks. While we waited for the boat to return, the convict that remained told the guard that he had stolen some food, including a pork pie from the blacksmith. The sergeant asked Joe, "Have you lost a pie?" "Yes, my wife did, just as you came in," said Joe. "So, you are the blacksmith," said the convict. "I'm sorry. I ate your pie because I was hungry." Joe said that it did not matter. He wouldn't like the convict to die because he didn't have anything to eat. Then the boat arrived and took the convict away to the hulks. Joe put me on his back and carried me home again. Mr. Wopsle was tired and often had to sit down and rest on the wet ground on our way back. I decided not to tell anyone that the convict was lying and that I had taken the pork pie. Back at home, everyone was surprised about the pie and wondered how the convict had gotten into the house and then into the pantry. Nobody ever thought that I took the pie. Chapter 3. How I Met Miss Havisham and Estella. Mrs. Joe's plan for me was that I would be a blacksmith like Joe, but I was not old enough yet. The neighbors asked me to do some jobs for them, and they paid Mrs. Joe for my work. She kept the money that I earned in a jar. At the time that I read the graves of my family in the churchyard, I could not read very well because I only went to evening school for 1 hour a week. The teacher was Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, and she slept most of the time. Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's granddaughter Biddy helped me learn how to read. One evening, I wrote a letter to Joe and showed it to him. Almost every word was wrong, but Joe didn't notice because he could only read his name. He told me that when he was small, he did not go to school. He said that his father used to hit his mother, and sometimes she ran away from him and took Joe with her. However, his father would always get them back again and hit them. Joe believed his father was good in his heart, but his problem was that he drank too much. Both of his parents died while he was still young. Eventually, he met my sister and married her. He remembered how badly his father had treated his mother and decided that he would never treat his wife badly. He would rather endure her anger than be angry with her. Joe believed that his wife was a good woman because she was looking after her baby brother. Mrs. Joe, of course, was not home when Joe told me all this. She was at the market with Uncle Pumblechook. When she came home, she was very excited. She said, "If this boy isn't thankful tonight, he never will be. I only hope she won't pamper him." "No, she is not like that," said Uncle Pumblechook. Joe and I did not know what they were talking about. Joe asked in confusion, "She?" Mrs. Joe practically yelled back at him, "Of course she, unless you call Miss Havisham a he. I don't think that even you would do that." Still confused, Joe asked, "Miss Havisham from uptown?" His wife said, "Unless you know a Miss Havisham downtown. She wants this boy here to go and play at her house. He is going, and he had better play, or I will make him suffer." Miss Havisham uptown was a very rich old lady who lived by herself in a large old house. Her house was locked up, and all the windows were barred. She never came out of the house. Mrs. Joe explained that Uncle Pumblechook had to pay her some rent, and she asked if he knew a boy that could come and play. Uncle Pumblechook told her about me. Mrs. Joe took me into the kitchen, scrubbed my face and hands, and made me put on clean clothes, and then Uncle Pumblechook took me in his carriage to his house. I slept at Uncle Pumblechook's house that night, although I spent more time awake than asleep. I stayed up most of the night, wondering what game Miss Havisham expected me to play at her house. The next morning, Uncle Pumblechook let me look in his shop and gave me some breakfast. All the time that I was eating, he kept giving me math to do. Suddenly, Uncle Pumblechook asked, "What is 7 and 8, and 4, and 2, and 8 again?" This is how he talked to me during breakfast and until we departed at 10 o'clock. I was pleased to escape Uncle Pumblechook's endless questions, but anxious about what would happen next. Miss Havisham's house was an old brick house that looked like a deserted house next to a deserted brewery. A pretty young girl of about my own age opened the gate to let me into the front yard, but she would not allow Uncle Pumblechook to enter. The young girl took me across the yard to the house and told me that the house was called Sadis, which meant enough in another language. It meant when it was named that whoever had this house could want nothing else, she explained. The girl, who acted much older than me and called me boy, took me into the house through a side door. The big front door was locked and barred. The inside of the house was completely dark, and she used a candle to lead me upstairs. At last we came to the door of a room and she said, "Go in, boy." The girl took the candle with her and left me there in the dark. I nervously knocked on the door and went in. On the other side of the door was a large room lit with candles, where an old lady sat at a table. She was the strangest lady I have ever seen or ever shall see. She was dressed all in white, like a bride for a wedding. She had white hair and wore some pretty jewels, but she wore only one white shoe. Another white shoe lay on the floor nearby. When I looked more carefully, I saw that her dress and shoes were not really white. They used to be white, but they had gone a little yellow with age. Looking more closely, I noticed that the lady was old and small and her dress was too big for her. She looked at me with dark eyes. She asked, "Who is it?" "Pip," I replied. "Mr. Pumblechook's boy, came to play." She told me to come closer, and I noticed that her watch had stopped at 20 minutes to 9, and that the clock on the wall had stopped at the same time. She moved her hands up to her left breast. "My heart is broken," she said. "I am tired of men and women. Play." I stood in front of her, not knowing what to do. "I'm sorry, Miss Havisham," I said. "I can't play just now. I would if I could. My sister will be angry with me if I don't, but it is so new here and so strange and sad." I stopped because I was afraid that I was saying too much. "Call Estella," she said. "Go to the door and call Estella." I did what she said, though it felt very strange to shout this girl's name into the dark house. The girl who had let me into the house came, and Miss Havisham showed her some jewels. "These will be yours one day, my dear," she said to Estella. "Now, let me see you play cards with this boy." Estella didn't want to do it and complained, "He's a common boy from the town." "Well, you can break his heart," said Miss Havisham. This idea seemed to interest Estella, so she got some cards and we played. She won because I was nervous and made many silly mistakes. We played another hand and she won again. She said that I was stupid and that I had rough hands and awful clothes. Miss Havisham asked me what I thought of Estella. I whispered that I thought she was pretty and proud, but rude, and that I would like to go home. Miss Havisham said I should come again in 6 days, and then she told Estella to give me something to eat and drink. She told Estella to let me look around the house while I ate. Estella took me downstairs and out through the side door. She commanded, "Wait here, boy." She went back in and brought me some bread, meat, and something to drink. When she gave them to me, she treated me as if I were a dog. She did not look at me or speak to me. After she went back in the house, I found a place where she could not see me, and I began to cry. I felt very bad about my hands and clothes. However, the food and drink were very good. As I ate and drank, I wandered about and looked around the yard. I also looked through the deserted brewery and thought of all the people who used to work there. I found a garden full of weeds with a small path in it, as if somebody walked there often. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw Estella walking through the garden. Then I saw her everywhere, in each of the brewery rooms I entered. In one of them, I thought I saw Miss Havisham hanging by the neck. Scared out of my wits, I ran out of the brewery and back to Sadie's. I'm sure it must have been nothing, but at the time I didn't know what to think. Estella came out of the house to let me out at the gate. Perhaps she saw my fear in my eyes and asked, "Why don't you cry?" "Because I don't want to," I answered. "Yes, you do," she said. "You are almost crying now." She laughed, pushed me out, and locked the gate. I went straight to Uncle Pumblechook's house, but he was not home, so I walked all the way back to my own home. Chapter 4. A Wedding Cake and a Fight. When I got home, my sister wanted to know all about the visit. I did not want to tell her about Miss Havisham and Estella, but she hit me and pushed my face into the kitchen wall. Then Uncle Pumblechook came and wanted to know all about it as well. I didn't know how to describe Miss Havisham, and I didn't want to talk about Estella. Therefore, I told Uncle Pumblechook and my sister a lot of lies. I told them that Miss Havisham was tall and dark, and that she was sitting on a black velvet cushion in her room when I entered. I told them that Estella handed me wine and cake on a gold plate. I also told them that there were 4 large dogs that were fighting over expensive meat given to them in a silver basket. They were amazed. My sister asked Uncle Pumblechook if he had ever seen Miss Havisham on a black velvet cushion. He had to admit that he had never seen her at all, but had only spoken to her through the door of her room. I told them that we all played with flags and swords. They were even more amazed. I told them there was no light in the room where we played except for candles. Uncle Pumblechook agreed that this was true, because he had seen it. At that point, they believed everything I told them. Later, they told Joe what I said, and he was amazed too. My sister and Uncle Pumblechook began to talk about what Miss Havisham might give me. My sister thought she might give me property, but Uncle Pumblechook thought she would probably give me money. Joe thought she might give me one of the fighting dogs. Later, I felt guilty for telling so many lies, and I admitted to Joe that I had lied. He was very disappointed. I told him that I did not want to be common, but he told me that telling lies would not help. However, we decided that we would not tell Mrs. Joe or Uncle Pumblechook that everything they had heard was lies. It would cause too much trouble. The next time that I saw Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's granddaughter Biddy, I asked her to teach me everything she knew. I did not learn anything at the evening school at Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's house. Every evening, the other boys in the class would eat apples and tease each other until Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt arrived. She would try to hit whoever was within reach with a stick, but we would all run out of the way. When our class actually began, we stood in a line and passed a book along the line. It had some letters in it, and we tried to read them. However, as soon as we began to read, Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt fell asleep. While she was sleeping, we would try to stamp on each other's toes as hard as we could. Finally, Biddy would pass out 3 Bibles for us to read. These were very old and dirty, and we had to read them aloud, even though we did not understand what we were reading. Then Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt would wake up. She would stagger to one of the boys and pull his ears. This ended the lesson, and we would run outside. I realized it would take a long time to become uncommon in this way, but I decided to try. Biddy agreed to help me, and the first night, she helped me to read the price list in the shop. On my way home, I stopped at the hotel to get Joe. He was smoking his pipe and drinking with Mr. Wopsle and a stranger. The stranger asked about me. He wanted to know my name. He thought I was Joe's son or nephew, and it took Joe a long time to explain that I was his wife's brother. The man kept looking at me in a strange way. Then he showed me that he had the file that I had given to the convict in the churchyard. The others did not see this. I was surprised and frightened. The stranger put the file in his pocket and stopped looking at me. We were about to leave when the stranger said, "I think there is a shilling in my pocket. If there is, I'll give it to the boy." He looked in his pocket and found a shilling. He put it in some paper and gave it to me with a wink. When we told Mrs. Joe about the shilling, she wanted to see it. She found that the paper was actually 2-pound notes. Joe ran back to the hotel to give the money back to the man, but he was not there. Joe left a message in case the stranger ever returned. Mrs. Joe put the money in an envelope and then put the envelope in a teapot in the guest room. It stayed there for a long time. When I went back to see Miss Havisham, Estella let me in and took me to another part of the house that was actually a separate building. It may have been where the manager of the brewery once lived. "Go into that room and stand by the window, boy," said Estella. There were 3 ladies and 1 gentleman in the room. They looked at me but did not speak to me. I stood by the window and looked out at the garden, all the while listening to the people speaking. One of the ladies was called Camilla, and another was Sarah Pocket. The third lady, who did not speak much, was called Georgiana. The gentleman was called Cousin Raymond. They were talking about somebody called Matthew and complaining that he did not respect the family. Then a bell rang. Estella commanded me, "Now, boy." She led me out of the room and along the passage toward Miss Havisham's room, but she suddenly stopped and looked at me. Unexpectedly, she asked me, "Am I pretty?" "Yes, I think you are very pretty," I replied. Then she asked, "Am I rude?" "Not as much as last time," I answered. She hit me in the face. "Now, you little monster, what do you think of me now?" Desperately trying to hold back the tears I felt in my eyes, I said, "I won't tell you." Watching me blink back my tears, she asked, "Why don't you cry?" "Because I will never cry for you again," I said. This was not true. As we went up the stairs, we met a large gentleman coming down the stairs. He was bald and had big black eyebrows and a gold watch. He stopped and looked at me. He asked, "A boy from the village?" "Yes," I replied. "Make sure you behave yourself," he said, and continued down the stairs. When I went into Miss Havisham's room, she told me to go into the next room and wait for her. This room was just as dark as Miss Havisham's room, and was only lit by candles. Even in the dim light, I could see that everything was covered in dust. There was a long table in the middle of the room, upon which I could see a large object covered in dust and cobwebs. As I stood perfectly still in the middle of the room, I saw spiders crawling here and there and heard mice. Finally, Miss Havisham came in and put her hand on my shoulder. She pointed at the table with her stick. She told me, "That is where I will lie when I am dead. They will come to look at me here." Then she pointed at the large object covered in cobwebs and told me it was her wedding cake. She wanted me to walk her around the room. She leaned on my shoulder and we walked. Then she told me to call Estella. The 3 ladies and 1 gentleman came with Estella, but Miss Havisham hardly gave them any notice. She told me to continue walking her around the room. "Dear Miss Havisham," said Sarah Pocket, "how well you look." "I look old and sick," said Miss Havisham. Camilla said that she worried about Miss Havisham every night. Miss Havisham and I kept going around and around the room, and the others spoke. Each of them was trying to prove how much they cared for Miss Havisham, and how much the others did not. Camilla complained about Matthew again. "He never comes to see Miss Havisham," she said, "while I lie awake for hours every night, worrying about her health and wondering why Matthew does not come to see her. Nobody ever thanks me." Georgiana asked, "Who did you think would thank you?" "Matthew will come to see me when I am laid out on this table," said Miss Havisham to Camilla. "This will be his place," she informed us, hitting the table with her stick. "Your place will be here, and your husband will be here, and Sarah Pocket will be here, and Georgiana will be here." Each time she said "here," she hit the table with her stick to show where each of them would be. She told me to continue walking her, and the ladies and gentlemen left. After they had gone, Miss Havisham told me that it was her birthday. I don't let anyone speak of it, she said. I allow them to come and see me, but they must not say anything about my birthday. It was on my birthday long ago that this was brought here. She pointed at the cake again. Miss Havisham, Estella, and I stood and looked at the cake for a while. Nobody spoke. Then suddenly Miss Havisham told us to play cards again. We returned to her room and Estella and I played cards. She beat me again. Miss Havisham watched us all the time. Estella did not speak. At the end of the game, she took me outside and gave me food and drink, just like the last time. I walked around in the garden and looked through the window of the building I was in before. There was a boy sitting at a table and reading. When he saw me, he came out and shouted, "Hello!" I shouted back, "Hello!" Approaching closer, he asked, "Who let you in?" "Estella," I replied. "Come and fight," he said. The boy was taller than me and very pale, but about my age. Without warning, he pulled my hair and hit me in the stomach with his head. Then he said, "Now you have a reason to fight me." I tried to hit him, but he danced out of the way. He ran off to a corner of the garden where someone had left some water in a jar. He took off his coat and his shirt and began to dance around me, holding his hands up ready to hit me. I hit him first. I was very surprised to see him fall down, and when he rolled over, I saw that his nose was bleeding. He got back up. I hit him again and was surprised again when he fell down. This happened again and again. Every time he got up, he cleaned himself with the water before I knocked him down again. In the end, he stopped and told me I had won. He dressed himself and went back into his room. I found Estella and she brought me back inside the house. In her usual commanding voice, she ordered, "Come here." She looked very pleased. "You may kiss me." I kissed her cheek, but I did not think she was very friendly. It was like giving a common boy a piece of money. It was almost dark by the time I went home. Chapter 5. My Sister's Accident. I was very worried about the young gentleman I had fought. I thought I would be punished for what I had done to him, so I was very afraid when I returned to Miss Havisham's house. I looked for the pale young man, but could not find him, and nobody said anything at all about him. Miss Havisham had a chair with wheels on it outside her room. On this visit to her house, I pushed the old lady around and around the room with the cake in it. I came back every second day to do this chore for her. Miss Havisham began to ask questions about me, and I told her that I would be a blacksmith like Joe. Estella never asked me to kiss her again. Sometimes she was friendly, but most times she was cold and unfriendly, and on several occasions she told me that she hated me. Every time I went there, I got my dinner, but Miss Havisham never paid me or promised me anything else. Miss Havisham always wanted to know if I thought Estella was pretty. I told her that she was. "Break their hearts," she would tell Estella. Joe used to sing a song called Old Clem while he was working. Once Miss Havisham asked me to sing. I sang this song for her. We sang it often after that, but very quietly. Even Estella joined in. I didn't tell Joe about the pale young gentleman, but I did tell Biddy because she was always ready to listen to me. Uncle Pumblechook often came to our house to talk to my sister about what Miss Havisham might give me, and after some time, this began to annoy me very much. One day, after about 10 months, Miss Havisham stopped me as we were walking. "You're growing tall," she said. She did not sound happy. She told me to bring Joe with me the next time that I visited, so that I could be apprenticed to him and become a blacksmith. My sister was very angry to hear that Miss Havisham wanted to talk to Joe without her. On the day that I went to Miss Havisham's house with Joe, he was dressed in his best clothes. Mrs. Joe walked with us uptown and stayed at Uncle Pumblechook's shop while we went on to the house. When Estella let us in, I could see that Joe was very nervous. Miss Havisham asked Joe some questions. Joe would not answer her, but spoke to me as if I had asked the questions. At the end of the conversation, Miss Havisham gave Joe a bag with 25 pounds in it and told me that I should start to work with him. She told me that I did not need to come back to her house. Then she told Joe that he should never ask for anything else from her. After Estella had let us out of the gate, Joe leaned against the wall as if to rest. "Amazing," he said. He stayed there and said it again. It took a long time before he could walk away from the house. When we went into Uncle Pumblechook's shop, my sister was waiting for us. "How much have you got?" she asked him. She laughed, which surprised me, because I did not often see my sister laugh. When Joe told her how much Miss Havisham had given him, she and Uncle Pumblechook were very pleased. That evening they had a party with the Hubbells and Mr. Wopsle. They told me to enjoy myself, but I could not make myself happy. By the time I went to bed that night, I was certain that I did not want to be a blacksmith. I had never been very happy at home because of my sister's angry temper, though I always loved Joe. Now, however, I began to be more unhappy with my circumstances. I saw that everything was common and that this was to be my life. Although I used to think that it would be wonderful to be a blacksmith like Joe, I didn't think so now. Over the weeks and months that followed, I stayed and worked hard because of Joe. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew I did not want to be a blacksmith all my life. I imagined Estella seeing me working, and I was embarrassed because I was common. I was now too big to go to Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's classes. Biddy taught me a bit more reading, and then I asked Mr. Wopsle himself to teach me, but this did not last long. He was too interested in showing how much he knew, and was not the least interested in teaching me what I needed to learn. I also tried to teach Joe everything I learned, but I don't think he learned very much from me. In the summer, we sat out in the marshes, where I read to him as well as I could. One day I asked him for some advice. I was thinking about going to see Miss Havisham to say thank you to her for the money, but Joe said it was not a good idea. "When Miss Havisham said that was all we should expect, I am sure she meant it," he said. "She was saying goodbye. This is the end. Don't come back." I thought about this, but I still felt I should say thank you. I actually wanted to go to the house to see Estella, and Joe realized this. He allowed me to have a half-holiday to go and visit Miss Havisham's house. Joe had hired a man called Orlick, who came in every day to help with the work. Orlick was a big, unhappy man. When he heard that I had a half-holiday, he wanted one too. Joe did not want to give it to him, but Orlick argued with him, and finally Joe agreed. My sister heard this and was very angry at both Joe and Orlick. Orlick called her some names, and she became angrier and angrier until she was screaming at him. Joe told Orlick to be quiet, but he still abused Mrs. Joe with more bad names. Then Joe and Orlick fought, and Joe punched Orlick so hard that the big man fell on the ground, just like the pale young man whom I had fought. My sister fainted, and Joe had to carry her back to the house. Afterward, I found Joe and Orlick cleaning up and quietly drinking beer together. I went to Miss Havisham's house and nervously rang the bell. Miss Sarah Pocket came to the gate instead of Estella. Miss Pocket let me in and allowed me to go up to Miss Havisham's room. Everything was just the same as before. "I hope you do not want anything," said Miss Havisham. "I won't give you anything." "No, Miss Havisham," I answered. "I just want to say thank you and to tell you that I'm still working at my apprenticeship." "Good," she said. "Come and see me sometimes. Come on your birthday." Then she saw me looking around the room and asked, "Are you looking for Estella?" "I hope she is well," I said. "She is abroad," Miss Havisham informed me. "She is becoming a lady. She is prettier than ever. Everybody admires her. Do you feel that you have lost her?" It seemed to me that Miss Havisham was happy to see me unhappy. Then she sent me home. I walked home slowly and saw Mr. Wopsle coming out of the bookshop. He saw me too and made me come with him to Uncle Pumblechook's house, where we read some of his new book, which was a play about an apprentice who robbed and murdered his master. Mr. Wopsle and Uncle Pumblechook looked at me as if I were the bad apprentice in the play. At the end, Uncle Pumblechook warned me not to turn out like that bad apprentice. By now it was quite dark, and a heavy mist lay on the ground as Mr. Wopsle and I walked toward home. We saw a man ahead of us coming toward us out of the darkness. It was Orlick. "You're late," I said. "You are late too," he replied. He told us that he had been uptown for his half-holiday. Suddenly we heard gunshots. "More convicts escaped," said Orlick. "It's a good night to escape. It will be hard to find them." When the three of us came to the village, we saw all the lights on in the hotel. Mr. Wopsle went in to see what was happening, but a moment later he ran out. "There's something wrong at your house, Pip," he exclaimed, and continued to run right past us. Orlick and I ran with him. "Someone came into your house while Joe was away, probably convicts. Someone is hurt." When we arrived at the house, we saw a lot of people there. There was the doctor, Joe, and a lot of women. I saw my sister lying on the kitchen floor. There was nothing taken from the house, and nothing was out of order in the kitchen, other than my fallen sister. She appeared to have been hit on the back of the head. From what everyone was saying, I learned that nobody knew who had done it. Chapter 6. How I Met Mr. Jaggers. Because of Mr. Wopsle's play about the apprentice who murdered his master, I thought that I must have done something to my sister. By the next morning, however, I realized that I had not done anything. This is what happened. Joe was at the hotel from 8:15 until 9:45. A farm worker saw Mrs. Joe at the kitchen door at some time before 9 o'clock. When Joe came home, he found his wife lying on the floor. The fire had not burned out, and nothing had been taken from any part of the house. Next to his wife, Joe noticed an iron ring, such as one would find around a convict's leg. It had been filed apart some time ago, so it did not belong to one of the convicts who escaped that night. Naturally, I thought it must have been my convict's iron ring. Perhaps the man who showed me the file in the hotel, or perhaps Orlick, had gotten this ring and used it to attack my sister. Orlick had been in town, and several people had seen him during the evening. It was true that he quarreled with my sister, but that did not seem unusual since my sister quarreled with everyone. The strange man might have come for his £2, but my sister was ready to give it to him, so he would have no reason to attack her. The police officers and detective asked lots of questions and had lots of ideas, but after a week or two, they all left without ever finding out who did it. My sister lay ill in bed for a long time, and after the attack she was very different. She couldn't remember much, and she could not speak. When she could finally come and sit in the kitchen, she had to write down whatever she wanted. Since none of us could read or write very well, this was not an easy situation for any of us. However, my sister was patient and never became angry. Then Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt died, and Biddy came to nurse my sister. One day my sister drew a hammer, and Biddy guessed that she wanted to see Orlick. When we brought him to the kitchen, my sister was very kind to him, smiling at him and offering him something to drink. She began to ask for him every day. Work in the blacksmith shop went on, though I began to hate my work and be embarrassed about my home. My birthday arrived and I went to visit Miss Havisham, who gave me £1. Estella was still abroad, and everything else was exactly the same as before. I began to notice that Biddy was actually a clever girl, though she would never be beautiful like Estella. She often reminded me that she was my first teacher. One Sunday I asked her to walk with me in the marshes, and thanks to the lovely weather, we both enjoyed our walk. "I want to be a gentleman," I told her during our walk. "I think you will be happier if you stay as you are," said Biddy. "I am not happy now," I informed her. "I don't like my work or my life." "I want you to do well and be comfortable," she said. "I can never be comfortable unless my life is very different than what it is now," I answered. "That's a pity," she said, looking sad and stopping to sit a while. I agreed, and sitting with her, I added, "If I could love my work half as much as I did when I was small, it would be better for us all. I would become Joe's partner, and perhaps yours as well. Instead of that, I am terribly unsatisfied with things. I don't want to be common. I wish nobody had ever told me I was common." Biddy said, "That's neither true nor polite. You are certainly not common. Who told you that you were?" "The beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's," I confessed. "She is more beautiful than anybody, and I admire her very much. It is because of her that I want to become a gentleman." "If you want to be a gentleman to prove her wrong, you would do it more easily by ignoring what she says. If you want to win her, I would say that she is not worth it." Biddy kindly put her hand on my hands and patted my shoulder. She then asked, "Shall we walk further, or shall we return home?" I got up, put my arm around her neck, and kissed her. "I shall always tell you everything," I said. "Until you are a gentleman," said Biddy. "You know I never will be, so that's always," I said. As we walked on, I realized that Estella would never give me anything but pain. I wished I could forget her. At that moment, I wished that I could love Biddy and be happy, and I told her what I was thinking. "You will never love me," she said. We came across Orlick as we walked past the churchyard. He suggested walking home with us. "Don't let him come with us," whispered Biddy. "I don't like him, but I am afraid that he likes me." I watched Orlick after that incident and made sure that he was never alone with Biddy. I would have asked Joe to dismiss him, but for some reason my sister always wanted to see him. I continued to work, trying my best to be happy, and sometimes I almost succeeded. I would make up my mind that I would be Joe's partner and marry Biddy, but then I would remember something about Miss Havisham or Estella, and it would destroy my dreams. In the 4th year of my apprenticeship, a group of men in the hotel, including myself, were listening to Mr. Wopsle as he read the newspaper. He could read very well, and there was an interesting story about a murder that day. We were all listening carefully, and at the end of the story, we all decided that the man was guilty of murder. Then we noticed another man with big black eyebrows watching us and biting the side of his finger. Hearing our decision about the case, he said, "So, you have decided, have you? Guilty, of course." We looked at each other. Mr. Wopsle answered, "Yes, we would say that he is guilty." "But the law of England says that he is innocent until the court finds him guilty," said the man. He began to ask Mr. Wopsle questions about the story in the newspaper. "The prisoner has not given evidence yet," pointed out the stranger. "You have not heard the whole story yet, but you are willing to find him guilty and hang him. He may be innocent." Then he stood up and moved in front of the fire. "I believe there is a Joe Gargery here," said the man with the big black eyebrows. "Indeed, sir, that's me," said Joe. "And he has an apprentice called Pip," continued the stranger. "That's me," I said. Although he did not recognize me, I finally recognized him as the man I had met coming down the stairs at Miss Havisham's house on my second visit there. Looking at the two of us, he told Joe and me, "I wish to speak to you in private." Returning with us to our home, we all sat in the guest room. It was dark and we only had one candle for light. The man sat down and said, "My name is Jaggers. I am a lawyer in London, and I have some strange business to do with you. I will begin by telling you that this whole affair is not my idea." He paused and standing up put one foot on the chair. "Joe Gargery, would you give permission for this young man to leave his job if he asked you?" "I would not stand in his way," said Joe. Mr. Jaggers inquired further, asking, "Would you ask for money?" "No, sir, I would not," replied Joe. The lawyer, seeming rather pleased at this, said, "Don't forget that you said that, and don't try to change your mind later. I am here to tell you that your apprentice has great expectations. He will receive a large property, but he must come to London first and receive a proper education." I thought my dream was coming true, and Miss Havisham was going to make me a rich gentleman. Turning to me, Mr. Jaggers continued, "Your benefactor says that you must always be called Pip, and that you will never try to find out who this benefactor is or say anything about it to anyone. If you have any ideas about who it might be, they must remain your ideas. You will never say anything to anyone about it. Do you understand?" "Yes," I said. "Do you agree?" "Yes," I said again. "I already have enough money from your benefactor for your education and living expenses. Should you need money in the future, you are to come to me, because that is what I am being paid for. If I were not being paid, I would not have any part in this. Are you ready to begin with the tutor?" "Yes," I said again. "Do you currently have a tutor that you prefer?" "No," I said. "I know a tutor whose name is Matthew Pocket," said the lawyer. I knew this man was a relative of Miss Havisham. He was the relative that Camilla had complained about. Watching me carefully, Mr. Jaggers asked, "Do you know the name?" I answered, "I do, and I would be happy to try him." Mr. Jaggers nodded and said, "You will come to see his son in London first. When will you come?" I looked at Joe and he looked at me. "I think I can come immediately," I said. "No," said Mr. Jaggers. "First, you should buy some new clothes and dress like a gentleman. You should come to London in a week." He gave me £20 and asked, "Will that be enough?" Then looking at Joe again, he said, "Do you remember that you wanted nothing?" "Yes," agreed Joe. "I have permission to leave you a present as compensation," said the lawyer. Surprised, Joe asked, "Compensation? For what?" "For your loss," said the lawyer. Joe put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Nothing can compensate for the loss of Pip." When Mr. Jaggers repeatedly offered compensation, Joe became angry and was ready to fight him. Mr. Jaggers surrendered the idea at that point and left, promising to send me his address. I ran after him and asked if it was all right to say goodbye to anyone in the town. He informed me that it would not be a problem. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Joe told Biddy about the visit. They both congratulated me on my good luck, but my sister did not understand. I decided that I would buy my new clothes in the village and leave them in Uncle Pumblechook's shop so that nobody would see them before I left. Joe thought that Uncle Pumblechook, Mr. Wopsle, the Hubbles, and his friends at the hotel might like to see me dressed as a gentleman. I told him I did not want them to see me like that. Biddy asked, "Will you come and show Joe and your sister and me?" "Of course," I promised. "I will bring the clothes home one evening and show you." Although I should have been happy and satisfied with my fortune, I felt uneasy for some reason and did not sleep well during the night. Chapter 7. London at last. In the morning I felt a bit happier and, in fact, I could not wait to leave for London. It was Sunday, and after going to church, we had an early dinner. Walking back to the marshes, I passed the church and thought about the people who came to that church every Sunday, and at the end of their lives would be buried in the churchyard. I felt sorry for them and decided that one day I would do something for them. I sat down to rest and wondered whether Miss Havisham intended me to marry Estella. Because I was tired from my sleepless night before, I fell asleep there in the marshes. When I woke up, I was surprised to find Joe sitting next to me. "This is the last time," he said, "so I thought I would follow you." "I'm glad you did," I told him, "and you can be sure that I will never forget you." He laughed and said, "I'm sure you won't." "It's a pity you didn't learn more when we had our lessons," I said. I thought that when I had some money, I would help Joe, and it would be good if he had more education. However, he misunderstood what I meant. "I'm not very clever," he said, "but it is not a pity. I am a blacksmith, and I need nothing else." We walked home together, and after tea, I went out again for a walk with Biddy. I asked her if she could help Joe with some education. "He is a very good man and very kind," I said, "but he is slow in learning and manners." Biddy asked, "Are his manners not good enough then?" "They are good enough for here," I said, "but—" Interrupting, Biddy said, "Good enough for here?" "Please, hear me out," I said. "If I take him away from here when I get my property, his manners will not be good enough for London." "He may be too proud to go to London," she replied. "There are different kinds of pride." Biddy's remark made me angry, and I told her so. That was the end of our conversation. The next morning I went to visit Mr. Trapp the tailor, but he treated me rather rudely until I told him that I had received a large property and was going to London. "I want some good clothes," I told him. Suddenly he became very polite, began to call me sir, and show me different kinds of cloth for my clothes. He shouted at his assistant, telling him he was lazy while he explained the different cloths to me and measured me. "I should not expect London gentlemen to buy clothes from a village tailor," he said, "but I would be very pleased if you could do that sometimes." Then he told his assistant to open the door for me, and I realized the power of money. I visited several other shops before going to see Uncle Pumblechook. He had prepared some food for me, called me his dear friend, and praised me for deserving my fortune. Of course, he reminded me that he had helped by bringing me to Miss Havisham. I asked him never to say anything about that. Then Uncle Pumblechook asked if he could shake my hand. Then he sat down. Then he stood up again. He gave me some wine and shook my hand again. He sat down again. He promised he would look after Joe and my sister while I was away. He stood up again, gave me more wine, and shook my hand again. We went on like this for some time, and I drank a lot of wine and began to think Uncle Pumblechook was a good man. He told me that he had a plan for a shop, but he needed more money to make it bigger. He asked my advice. I told him he should wait. He thought this was excellent advice and shook my hand again. When I left, he ran after me in the street to shake my hand again. The days went by, and on Friday, I went back to Uncle Pumblechook's house and put on my new clothes. Then I went up to Miss Havisham's house to say goodbye. Sarah Pocket came to the gate and was very surprised to see me in my fine new clothes. She took me up to Miss Havisham's room. "I am going to London tomorrow and wanted to say goodbye to you," I said. "Those are nice clothes," she said, pointing her stick at me. "I have come into a fortune since I last saw you," I said, "and I am very thankful for it." Sarah Pocket looked very uncomfortable, and Miss Havisham smiled at her. "Yes," said Miss Havisham. "Mr. Jaggers told me about it." "A rich person has become my benefactor," I told her. Miss Havisham nodded and asked, "But that person has not been named?" "No, Miss Havisham." "And Mr. Jaggers will look after you?" "Yes, Miss Havisham." She enjoyed asking these questions and seeing Sarah Pocket become more and more uncomfortable. Finally, she dismissed me by saying, "Well, goodbye, Pip." Then, as if reminding me, she added, "You will always keep the name of Pip, you know." "Yes, Miss Havisham." I left her standing next to her cobwebbed wedding cake. Sarah Pocket took me downstairs and let me out. At the gate, I said goodbye to her, but she did not answer. The next morning, after Biddy had prepared an early breakfast for me, I said goodbye to my sister, Joe, and Biddy, and walked out the door to the village. There I took my place on the coach to London. I began to cry as the coach started off and thought about going back and staying for another day. However, the coach continued on its way, and I simply sat in it and looked out at the world as we sped along our way. The journey from our village to London took about 5 hours. Upon arriving, I thought London was very big and frightening, but also dirty and ugly. Mr. Jaggers' address was Little Britain, and I found his office easily enough. Mr. Jaggers was in court that afternoon, and the clerk told me to wait in his room. A man with one eye was waiting there, but the clerk told him to leave. The room was quite small and dark. There were not many papers in it, but there was an old gun and an old sword on the wall. There were also pictures of 2 very fat faces and several boxes. It was a hot day and the 2 fat faces looked so ugly that I decided to wait outside and told the clerk that I needed some air. I walked around the corner and came to Smithfield, where I could see Newgate Prison and the courts. While waiting outside, I heard other people talking about Mr. Jaggers and realized that they were waiting for him too. When Mr. Jaggers arrived in the street, he spoke to each of the people waiting outside as he walked to the office with me. He spoke to them quite rudely, and they appeared to be afraid of him. I could see, however, that they all needed him. He asked each of them if they had paid Wemmick. One man wanted him to help his brother, who had been arrested for stealing. Mr. Jaggers told him that he was already working against his brother and pushed the man out of the way. Then Mr. Jaggers took me into his room, where he informed me to go to young Mr. Pocket and stay with him. On Monday, Mr. Pocket would take me to his father. Then Mr. Jaggers gave me a list of places where I could shop. The bills would come to Mr. Jaggers. Then he called Wemmick, who was the clerk I had seen earlier, and told him to take me to young Mr. Pocket. Chapter 8. How I Met the Pockets. Mr. Wemmick was a short man between 40 or 50 years old, with a square face. He told me he came from the country a long time ago and said there was a lot of crime in London. I asked him about Matthew Pocket, and he said he knew him, although he did not sound very pleased to know him. We walked to Barnard's Inn, where young Mr. Pocket was staying. It was a poor and sad place. Mr. Wemmick led me up some stairs until we came to a door with Mr. Pocket painted on it and a notice saying, "Back soon." Mr. Wemmick went back to his office, leaving me to wait on my own. I waited for half an hour before the young Mr. Pocket arrived, carrying some bags of food. He explained that he had been out shopping to get food for me. I was very surprised to discover that this was the pale young gentleman I had knocked down in the fight in Miss Havisham's garden. He did not recognize me at first, as he let me into his flat. Then, as he was showing me my room, he suddenly recognized me. Upon realizing who I was, he exclaimed, "You're the boy I fought in the yard." I admitted that I was, and as we looked at each other, we began to laugh. "I hope you will forgive me for knocking you about so much," he said. I smiled and we shook hands. He asked, "You had not come into your fortune at that time?" "No," I said. He confessed to me, "I was looking for a fortune myself. Miss Havisham had asked me to visit, and I thought if she liked me, perhaps she would become my benefactor, and I might marry Estella." I asked, "Were you disappointed?" "No, I don't like Estella at all, because Miss Havisham has taught her to treat all men badly." Wondering aloud, I asked, "Why did Miss Havisham teach her that?" Young Mr. Pocket seemed surprised at my ignorance regarding the matter. He said, "Don't you know? It is a good story. I will tell it at dinner." He told me that his name was Herbert, and he decided to call me Handel because I was a blacksmith, and Handel had written some beautiful music about a blacksmith. During dinner, Herbert taught me how to eat like a gentleman and told me Miss Havisham's story. Miss Havisham's mother died when she was a baby. Her father was a rich brewer, and he gave her everything she wanted. Mr. Havisham married again and had a son. Then the second, Mrs. Havisham, also died, and the son grew up rather badly. He wasted his money all the time, so when Mr. Havisham died, he left most of his money to Miss Havisham. His son had some money, but soon that was gone as well. Miss Havisham fell in love with a man who came to visit her, and he received large amounts of money from her. My father, Matthew Pocket, who is Miss Havisham's cousin, warned her that her new friend was only after her money. But Miss Havisham said she would marry him and ordered my father out of the house. My father has not seen her since then. All her other relatives are poor and want to get her money when she dies, so they didn't dare to disagree with her or say anything against her friend. However, my father was right. On the day of the wedding, the man did not come, but only sent her a letter. On that day, she stopped the clocks and closed the curtains. She has not seen the light of day since that day. People think that the man was probably a friend of Miss Havisham's half-brother, and that they shared the money that he got from her. I asked Herbert what happened to the two men. He said they wasted all their money, but he did not know if they were still alive. I asked about Estella, and he said that she was adopted. He did not know why or when. Herbert then told me how he intended to become rich. They were wonderful plans, but he had not started yet. In fact, he had no money and was looking around for any good chance to come along. I thought he would never be rich. The next day was Sunday, and we went to church in Westminster Abbey. In the afternoon, we enjoyed a walk through the parks. I had left Joe and Biddy only the day before, but it seemed like many months ago. London was another world. On Monday morning, I went with Herbert to the office, where he hoped to make his fortune. It did not look like a good place to make a fortune because everybody there looked annoyed and unhappy. After lunch, we took a coach to Hammersmith, where Herbert's father lived. I was to stay at his house while he was teaching me. We arrived there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon and saw some children playing in the garden. Mrs. Pocket was sitting on a chair under a tree reading a book, with her feet up on another chair, while 2 nursemaids were looking after the children. Herbert introduced me to his mother. One of the nursemaids told 2 of the children to stay away from the river. At the same time, she picked up Mrs. Pocket's handkerchief. "That is 6 times you've dropped it this morning," she said. Mrs. Pocket just laughed and said, "Thank you, Flopson." Then she turned back to her book. Suddenly turning to me, the nursemaid said, "I hope your mother is well." I tried to explain that I had no mother, and the nursemaid came and picked up the handkerchief again. "That is 7 times," she said, handing the handkerchief back to Mrs. Pocket. Mrs. Pocket took the handkerchief, saying again, "Thank you, Flopsome," and went back to her reading. She seemed to forget all about me. I counted the children. There were 6 of them. Then I heard a baby cry in the house, and the other nursemaid, whose name was Millers, went into the house to tend to the baby. Mrs. Pocket simply kept reading. I wondered what book she was reading. Millers came out with the baby and gave it to Flopsome, who gave it to Mrs. Pocket. "Take the baby," she said, "and give me your book." Mrs. Pocket gave her the book and took the baby. She played with the baby for a few moments and then said that all the children should go inside for their afternoon nap. The 2 nursemaids got all the children in, and then Mr. Pocket came out to meet me. Mr. Pocket always looked puzzled, and his gray hair was a mess, but I liked him because he did not pretend to be somebody he was not. Mr. Pocket took me into the house and showed me a comfortable room, which he told me was to be my room. He also introduced me to 2 other young men who had rooms there. Their names were Drummle and Startop, and they were studying with Mr. Pocket. The servants in the house seemed to manage everything, since Mr. and Mrs. Pocket were not very practical. They looked after the Pockets, but made sure they looked after themselves too. They always seemed to have the best food and drink. On my first evening there, I met Mrs. Quayler, a neighbor who had dinner with us. I heard Mr. Drummle talking to Mrs. Pocket and discovered that she believed her husband might one day have a title in society. Mrs. Pocket's parents had apparently been upset that she married a man without a title. In fact, the book that Mrs. Pocket had been reading under the tree that afternoon was all about titles. Then a servant came in to say that the cook had lost the beef, and Mr. Pocket put down his knife and fork and began to pull his hair as if he wanted to lift himself up. I soon learned that this was how he always behaved when there was a problem. The children came in after dinner, and I saw that there were 4 girls, 2 boys, and the baby. Flopsome gave the baby to Mrs. Pocket. Mrs. Pocket took the baby, but it soon hit its head on top of the table. Flopsome took the baby back and gave it to Jane, one of the little girls, and Jane stopped it from crying. The baby began to laugh, and we all laughed with it. Flopsam then gave the baby back to Mrs. Pocket, who let the baby play with the nutcracker. Mrs. Pocket talked to Drummle about titles and forgot all about the baby. When Jane saw that the baby was in danger, she quietly took the nutcracker away from it. Mrs. Pocket, noticing this and becoming annoyed, told Jane that she was a naughty girl for interfering. Mr. Pocket lifted himself by his hair. "She was trying to save the baby," he told his wife. "I will not allow Jane to interfere," said Mrs. Pocket, "and I am surprised that you will allow her to do so." Mrs. Pocket sent Jane out of the room and then sent the baby out as well. The other children were given a shilling each by Mr. Pocket, and they all left. During supper that evening, a servant came in and asked to speak to Mr. Pocket. But Mrs. Pocket was annoyed again. "You can speak to your master after supper," she informed the servant. However, Mr. Pocket went out with the servant, and when he returned, he said that the cook was lying drunk on the kitchen floor. Mrs. Pocket blamed the servant who came in for making trouble. Mrs. Pocket complained, "It's all her fault." Mr. Pocket began pulling his hair again, and I decided it was time to go to bed. Chapter 9. Dinner with Wemmick. After I bought all the things I needed and made myself at home in my room, Mr. Pocket and I had a long talk about my education. Mr. Jaggers had told him that I did not need to study for any work, but that I should have a general education so that I would be like other rich men. Mr. Pocket worked very hard to help me, so I worked hard too. I decided that it would be nice to keep my room in Herbert's flat at Gray's Inn if I put my own furniture in it. I went to Mr. Jaggers to ask his opinion about this, but he had no opinion. He only asked, "How much money will you need? 50 pounds? "I don't think I would need all that much," I answered. 5 pounds then? "Perhaps that would not be enough." "How much then?" "I don't know." "How about 2 times 5 pounds? 3 times? 4 times? 4 times would be enough." "4 times 5 pounds then. What do you make that?" "I suppose you make it 20 pounds, I replied. "It doesn't matter what I make it. What do you make it?" 20 pounds, I said. Mr. Jaggers shouted to his clerk, "Wemmick, give Mr. Pip 20 pounds. When I went to the clerk who gave me 20 pounds, I told him that I did not know what to make of Mr. Jaggers' manner. "Tell him that and he will be happy," said Mr. Wemmick, "because that's his intention. It's how he does his job, and he is very good at his job." Then Wemmick took me to see the other clerks, of whom there were only 3, each working in his own room. The first was a large, pale man who was talking to 3 people at once. The second was a small man with very long hair, and the third was a high-shouldered man, dressed all in black with a bandage on his head. I asked them about the 2 pictures in Mr. Jaggers' room, and they were criminals who had been Mr. Jaggers' customers, and who at last were hanged. Wemmick showed me some of the presents that these people had given him before they died. Then he invited me to come to his house one day and have supper with him. "Mr. Jaggers will invite you to dine with him one day," Wemmick told me. "When you go there, you should look carefully at his housekeeper, who is like a wild animal made tame by Mr. Jaggers." Wemmick took me to the court, and I saw Mr. Jaggers at work. It was very interesting. He shouted at everybody and spoke to them rudely as he spoke to me. I learned more about Mr. Pocket's other students. Drummle, best described as unfriendly, heavy, and slow, had rich parents, but he was not a clever student at all. Startop, on the other hand, was friendlier. His mother, a weak woman, had kept him home when she should have sent him to school, so he had turned out very much like his mother, and always talked about her. In the evening, we would go boating in the river. Drummle always stayed behind us and close to the banks of the river. I bought a boat and shared it with Herbert, who often went boating with us. He was my true friend. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Camilla came to visit, together with Georgiana. Camilla was Mr. Pocket's sister, and Georgiana was a cousin. They hated me right off and found it difficult to be polite to me. I began to spend a lot of money, but I continued to make good progress in my studies, which pleased Mr. Pocket. One evening, Wemmick invited me to his house, and we walked there together from Mr. Jagger's office. On the way, he told me about the food he had prepared for supper, and warned me that he had a very old father living with him. We talked about Mr. Jaggers, and Wemmick told me that Mr. Jaggers never locked his house because he believed that nobody would dare to rob him. Wemmick lived in a small wooden house with gardens all around it, but he made it look like a castle. He had dug a hole in front of his house and put a drawbridge over it, and he even had a flagstaff and put up a flag every Sunday. He also showed me a small cannon, which he said he fired every night at exactly 9 o'clock. At the back of the house, he kept a pig, some chickens and rabbits, as well as a vegetable garden. There was also a small round pond with a very small island in it, which Wemmick told me he had made himself. If enemies attacked me, he said, I could keep them out for ages. He introduced me to his very old father, who was completely deaf but very happy to have people simply nod at him. "My son has a very fine house," said the old father. I nodded and the old man smiled. Wemmick told me that Mr. Jaggers had never seen the castle and never met his father. "He has not even heard about him," Wemmick added. "When I go to the office, I leave the castle behind me, and when I am in the castle, I leave the office behind me." It was almost time to fire the cannon. Wemmick's father, who had prepared everything for firing the cannon, was quite excited. When the cannon was shot, it made a very loud noise, and Wemmick's father shouted, "I heard it!" We had an excellent supper in that small house. After supper, we talked for a while longer before Wemmick showed me to a small bedroom where I slept that night. The next day, Mr. Jaggers invited me to come to his house for supper, and to bring Drummle, Startop, and Herbert with me. We walked to his house from the office. His house was much larger than Wemmick's house, but it needed some paint and the windows were dirty. Mr. Jaggers led us upstairs because although he owned the whole house, he only used 3 of the rooms upstairs. One of the rooms was his bedroom, the second was his dressing room, and the third was his dining room, where we sat for dinner. Mr. Jaggers seemed very interested in Drummle and talked to him the entire evening, while Startop and Herbert did not seem to interest him at all. The housekeeper, a tall, thin, and pale woman with a lot of hair and dark eyes, brought the food to the table. She watched Mr. Jaggers very carefully. We had an excellent meal. When we had finished, we talked about rowing on the river and complained about Drummle always coming in behind us. He said that he was stronger than any of us, but preferred to be alone. To prove his strength, he bared his arm to show his muscles, and we followed suit. Mr. Jaggers suddenly took hold of his housekeeper's arm and made her show us her hands. She had strong hands with many scars on them. "You can go now, Molly," he told the housekeeper. Mr. Jaggers continued to show a lot of interest in Drummle and listened intently as Drummle complained about us and said that we spent too much money. I reminded him that he had borrowed some money from Startop a week ago. "I will pay him back," said Drummle. "I am sure you will," I replied. "However, you should not complain about how we spend our money. I don't think you would lend us any money if we needed it." He agreed, remarking, "No, I would not. I would not lend money to anybody, and I think you are weak to lend it to me." He became quite angry and was about to throw a glass of wine at Startop, when Mr. Jaggers stopped him and said it was time to go home. Later, Mr. Jaggers told me that he liked Drummle, and though I said I was pleased, I had to admit that I did not like him at all. "No, that's right," he said. "Stay away from him. However, I think he is very interesting, and I like him a lot." About a month after this, Drummle's time with Mr. Pocket came to an end, and he went back to his family home. Chapter 10. Love her, love her, love her. I received a letter from Biddy addressed to Dear Mr. Pip, and in it, she told me that Joe was coming to London with Mr. Wopsle and would like to visit me. They were arriving the next day, so I did not have much time to prepare. I was not very happy to have this news because I felt our meeting would be difficult since I was a gentleman now and he was still a blacksmith. By this time I had bought some nice furniture and had even employed a servant, a small boy named Pepper. I had him dressed in fine clothes. However, he was a problem for me because I always had to find him something to do and something to eat. The next morning, I made everything look as good as I could. It was a rainy day, however, and Gray's Inn did not look very pleasant. While waiting for Joe, I put Pepper in the hall to open the door upon his arrival. Finally, I heard Joe coming up the stairs in his heavy boots. Then Pepper came into my room and announced that Mr. Gargery was here to see me. Joe came in and shook my hand until I thought my arm would fall off. He was looking well and told me that my sister and Biddy were the same as always. He couldn't stop looking at all the things in the room and spoke to me as politely as he could. He told me that Mr. Wopsle had decided to try acting in the theater. Joe had seen him act the night before, but thought the audience was very rude to laugh at Mr. Wopsle's performance and throw food at him. Herbert came into the room and wanted to shake Joe's hand, but Joe backed away from him and referred to himself as Herbert's servant. Then Joe said that he wondered if we were healthy in this flat. "It may be very good in terms of a London flat," he said, "but I wouldn't keep a pig in it." We asked him to sit down at the table, and he looked for a place to put his hat. He put it on the corner of a chair, but it kept falling off. Joe merely put it back in the same place each time. While we had a cup of tea, Joe explained that he had seen the sights of London. He and Mr. Wopsle had been to the factory that made shoe polish because they saw pictures of it on the bottles, but he did not think that the factory was as nice as its picture. We had a difficult meal. Joe was obviously uncomfortable dressed in clothes that did not suit him, and he kept dropping his food and didn't know what to say. He could only stare around himself at the furniture. At last, after Herbert went out for the evening and left Joe and I alone, Joe told me that he had something important to tell me. I was at the hotel one night, and Pumblechook came and told me that Miss Havisham wanted to speak to me. I was very nervous about it, but the next day I made myself as clean as I could and went up to her house. She asked me to tell you that Estella came home from abroad and that she would like you to come and see her. I asked Biddy to write to you about it, but she said that you would rather hear it in person and told me to come to London with Mr. Wopsle. I was both surprised and pleased to receive this invitation. When Joe finally got up to go, I asked him to stay or to come back for dinner, but he refused. "I do not fit in these clothes, and I will never wear them again," he said. "I do not belong here. You are welcome to come and see me in the blacksmith shop, and then you can visit the real me. This is not me." Of course, I decided to act on Miss Havisham's invitation as soon as I could. The very next day, I purchased a seat on the coach. My first thought was to stay at Joe's, but in the end, I decided it would be better to stay at the hotel. I also decided not to take Pepper with me, because I didn't want people like Trabb, the tailor's boy, to talk to him and tell him about my past. On the coach from London that afternoon, there were several other passengers, including 2 convicts and a police officer going down to the hulks. I recognized one of the convicts as the man who showed me the file and gave me a shilling wrapped in 2 one-pound notes. I was very glad that he did not seem to recognize me. He sat behind me on the coach, and I could feel his breathing on the back of my neck. I wondered whether I should try to give this convict the £2 he had given me so many years ago. But I didn't know how to go about it. Instead, I fell asleep while I was thinking about this. I woke up to hear the convict say, 2 one-pound notes. "How did he get them?" said the other convict. "I don't know," said the first convict. "He gave them to me when I was getting out. He asked me to find the boy who helped him and give him the money. I said I would, and I did." "What happened to him?" said the other convict. "He was put in prison for life." When I heard this, I was frightened and wanted to get off the coach. However, the convict had not recognized me, so I stayed on the coach until we arrived in the town. At the hotel, I ordered a meal and then read in the local newspaper that Uncle Pumblechook was still saying that he was the first friend and helper of a young man who now had great expectations. The next morning, I was up early and went for a walk in the town, thinking about the plans that Miss Havisham had for me. I was sure she wanted me to marry Estella and to make her house a happy house again. Although I was sure that I loved Estella, I did not believe that she would ever make me happy. But that did not matter. I loved her and could not stop. When I arrived at Miss Havisham's house, I rang the bell and was surprised that the person who opened the gate for me was not Estella. It was Orlick. I asked him, "How did you get here?" "On my legs," he answered. "You are not the only one to have a change." "Are you here for good?" "I'm not here for bad." "So you have left the forge?" "Does this look like a forge?" He annoyed me very much with this way of answering my questions. Finally, I found out from him that Miss Havisham was afraid of escaped convicts and wanted a man to guard the gate. Orlick walked with me to the house, and there I met Sarah Pocket, who let me inside. In Miss Havisham's room, everything was still the same. At first, I did not recognize the lady who was with her, but then I realized that it was Estella. She was so beautiful and wonderful that she made me feel common again, even though I was now a gentleman. Estella and I walked in the garden, and she told me that she had seen me fight with Herbert all those years ago. I reminded her that she had asked me to kiss her then, and informed her that Herbert was now my best friend. "You must have different friends now that you are a gentleman," she said. "You cannot have the same friends that you had before." I decided at that moment that I would not go and see Joe. We talked about the first time I came to the house, and she gave me food. She said that she could not remember being kind to me even once, and that she had a hard heart then. She looked at me, and I thought I recognized something in her face, but I was not exactly sure what it was. Back in the house, Miss Havisham wanted me to push her around the old wedding cake again. Miss Havisham asked me, "Do you think she is beautiful? Do you admire her?" "Everybody who sees her must admire her," I said. She put her arm around my neck and put her head close to mine. She whispered with hot breath into my ear, "Love her, love her, love her. If she hurts you, love her. If she breaks your heart, love her." I adopted her to be loved. I educated her to be loved. Love her. Real love will suffer anything as mine did. Love her like that. I was surprised to find that Mr. Jaggers was a guest at dinner that night at the house, though Miss Havisham did not eat dinner with us. When we were alone, I asked him about Estella. "Is her name Havisham or—" He looked at me blankly and asked, "Or what?" "Is it Havisham?" "It is Havisham," he replied. That night I lay in my bed at the hotel, and I heard Miss Havisham's words again. "Love her, love her, love her." I whispered into the dark room, "I love her, I love her, I love her," 100 times or more. Could she really be my wife one day? Chapter 11. A Letter from Estella. The next morning I told Mr. Jaggers that I thought Orlick was not the right kind of man to have a job with Miss Havisham, and told him what I knew about Orlick. "Very well, Pip," he said. "I'll go there this morning and dismiss him." This seemed a very quick decision to me, and I was nervous about what I had now done. "He might quarrel with you," I said. "I don't think he will try to quarrel with me," said Mr. Jaggers confidently. I had to catch the coach to London at midday, but I didn't want to walk past Uncle Pumblechook's shop on my way to catch it. Therefore, I took a long detour behind my uncle's and got back on the main street well past the shop. I enjoyed being in the old town again. Some people recognized me and stared at my changed appearance, and I found this very pleasant. However, when I saw Trabb's boy coming toward me, I thought it would be best if I walked past him without saying anything. Suddenly I saw him fall to his knees. His hat then fell off, and his whole body began to shake. Kneeling there on the street, he called out, obviously in my direction, "Help me, please! I am so frightened!" As I passed him, his teeth began to chatter, and he fell down in the dust. I was more than a little annoyed at this dramatic performance, but I did nothing. I was, after all, a gentleman, and a gentleman need not concern himself with a tailor's boy. 200 yards further, I was amazed and a bit alarmed to see him coming toward me again. I supposed he must have run around the back street. He was walking along quite normally, but then he spied me and began his performance again, this time going around and around me with his hands in the air and asking for mercy. People were watching him and laughing. I hurried along, but a little further along the street, I saw him again. This time he was different, walking very straight with a group of friends. With his nose in the air, he said to them, "I don't know you." He pulled at his shirt collar, ran his hand through his hair, and addressed his friends again, claiming loudly, "I don't know you." They all laughed. Then he followed me, making sounds like a crow and flapping his arms like wings. Being in public on the street, there was nothing I could do to him, but I was very angry. The next day I wrote to Mr. Trabb and told him that I would buy no more clothes from a tailor who employed such a terrible boy. When I arrived in London, I felt guilty because I had not bothered to see Joe or Biddy, so I immediately sent some presents to them. Then I went to Barnard's Inn and talked to Herbert, confessing that I loved Estella. He appeared not at all surprised and told me that he already knew it. "But I did not tell you," I said. "You have told me every day," he said, "in the way that you talk about her. Does she love you?" I had to tell him that I did not think so. "Well, there is plenty of time, Handel," he said, calling me by the name that he had given me on the day we first became friends. "Yes, but I am anxious," I replied. "My hope of marrying her depends on my benefactor continuing to provide for me." "You may be sure that this is not a problem," Herbert assured me. "Mr. Jaggers would have nothing to do with it if it was not certain." I agreed that this was a good point and began to feel a little more confident in my situation. "Handel," Herbert continued, "has Mr. Jaggers ever said anything about marrying Estella as a condition of your great expectations?" "No," I replied. "Then can't you stop yourself from loving her?" "No," I replied, "I cannot. It is impossible." "Think of what she is, and what she will do to you, and how you will suffer." "I know, but I cannot stop loving her. It is impossible," I said. "You are my friend, Handel, and I want you to know what I think," said Herbert. "Now I will tell you something about myself." He told me that he was actually engaged to be married at some point in the future to a girl named Clara. The girl's father had provided food for passenger ships, but now he was an invalid. Herbert had never seen him because the girl's father lived secluded upstairs in Clara's house. "But I hear him all the time when I visit," he added, "because he knocks loudly on the floor and shouts when he wants something." I asked my friend, "Do you expect to meet him soon?" "Yes," he said. "I expect it every day because I am sure that one day he will fall through the ceiling with his knocking." This made us both laugh. That evening we went to see Mr. Wopsle play Hamlet in the theater. Hamlet is a very serious play, and Mr. Wopsle did his best to act seriously. However, many things went wrong during the performance, and most of the audience laughed at the actors. All things considered, it was a completely awful show. Actors forgot their lines and fell over each other, and the costumes used by the actors were not appropriate at all. During the performance, the audience kept interrupting and telling the actors how to improve the play. At the end of the play, we tried to escape before Mr. Wopsle could meet us, but we were not quick enough. He took us to his very small dressing room and asked us how we liked the play. We had to tell him that it was very good and that he played his part very well. He appeared pleased, but not surprised at our evaluation of his ability. He hoped that some of the other actors would improve with more practice. Feeling sorry for him, we invited him to have supper with us, and he stayed until late in the night, talking about his plans for the theater and his part in it. We were relieved when he finally went back to his hotel. Some days later, I was reading with Mr. Pocket when I received a letter from Estella. It did not even start Dear Pip, Dear Sir, or Dear anything. It just said that she was coming to London the day after tomorrow and that Miss Havisham had told her to inform me. I was both excited and anxious and could neither eat nor sleep after that. Upon the day of her arrival, I went to the coach station early in the morning. It was so early that the coach had not left our town yet. While I was waiting there, I saw Wemmick, who invited me to come with him to Newgate Prison, where he had to speak to a client. Since the coach would not arrive until the afternoon anyway, I had plenty of time, so I agreed to go with him. It turned out to be a very interesting visit. Many of the people in the prison knew Wemmick, in particular old clients, all of whom he insisted on greeting. He was friendly with them, but only talked about business matters related to their cases. If they asked him about their fees, he merely told them to ask Mr. Jaggers, knowing that they would never dare it. I was surprised to find out that one of the prisoners, whom Wemmick greeted and joked with, had been a soldier found guilty of counterfeiting and would be hanged in a few days' time. After walking with Wemmick back to the office in Little Britain, I returned to the coach station to wait for Estella. I began to wish that I had not visited the prison with Wemmick, because it made me feel common and dirty and not good enough for Estella. Finally, the coach arrived, and Estella waved at me through the window. Again, I thought I recognized something in her face, but I still did not know what it was. Chapter 12. My Sister's Funeral. Estella looked more beautiful than ever and was friendlier with me than she had ever been before. We got her luggage from the coach, and I asked her where she was going. "I am traveling to Richmond," she said. "It is about 10 miles away, so please call a carriage and take me there. Here is my purse." I did not want to take her money, but she told me that Miss Havisham had ordered it, and we both had to obey. I called a carriage, and while we waited, I ordered some tea, which took a long time to arrive. While we were waiting for the tea, Estella informed me, "I am going to a lady and her daughter in Richmond, who will introduce me to some important and rich families." "I suppose you will enjoy yourself," I said. "Yes, I suppose so," she answered without seeming to care. "You speak of yourself as if you were somebody else," I remarked. This made her smile. Estella asked, "How are you getting on with Mr. Pocket?" "I live pleasantly," I replied. Then I blurted out, "As pleasantly as I can away from you." She called me a silly boy then. We talked about the Pocket family, and she told me that they complained about me all the time and told Miss Havisham what a bad person I was. She confessed to me that she enjoyed seeing the Pockets unhappy because they had always made her unhappy. They were afraid that Miss Havisham would leave all the money to her. I kissed her hand and she called me a silly boy again and asked, "Will you never listen to the warning?" She allowed me to kiss her cheek again, as I had done many years before. Her face was hard and cold like stone. "Now, let us have some tea," she said, "and then we must go to Richmond." We had a bad but expensive tea before we took a carriage to Richmond. As we passed Newgate Prison, she asked me what it was. As I explained, I told her that Mr. Jaggers knew a lot of the people there. Our conversation turned to Mr. Jaggers, and I told her that I had dined at his house. Then we talked about the parts of London that we had passed. Riding along in the coach, I felt that Estella was making herself attractive to me, but it did not make me happy. I knew that she did it because Miss Havisham wanted her to do it, and not because she really cared for me. She told me I should come to visit her in Richmond. "It is part of Miss Havisham's plan for me, Pip," she said. It was the first time she had ever called me by my name. I knew I would remember that moment forever. I am sure that she knew it too. We arrived at Richmond too soon. When the coach stopped at a large old house, Estella simply said goodbye and went in. I looked at the house and thought how happy I would be to live there with Estella, though I knew that I was never happy when I was with her. I realized that I was changing. I tried not to think about Joe or Biddy because I felt guilty about the way I had behaved toward them. Sometimes I wished I had never met Miss Havisham and that I had grown up to be a blacksmith like Joe. However, I knew that this could never have happened unless I had not met Estella. I also began to realize that I was having a bad effect on other people. Poor Herbert, my best friend, was most hurt by me because I had much more money than he did. He would not accept any money from me, but because he spent as much as I did, he was always in debt and his life was no longer as simple as it had been before my arrival. We became part of a group of young men called the Finches of the Grove, who met every 2 weeks to eat and drink at expensive hotels and argue with each other about things that did not matter. Herbert was sometimes worried about his debts, but he was always hopeful that he would see his opportunity to make money soon. I spent about half of each week with Mr. Pocket and the other half with Herbert. Sometimes Herbert and I sat down together and added up our debts. To make the task enjoyable, we ordered good food and wine and then began listing everything we owed, which made us feel better. Then we would send away our bills, mine going to Mr. Jaggers and Herbert's going to his father. Then came the day that I received a letter from Trabb the tailor informing me that my sister was dead and that the funeral was to be the following Monday. It was the first time that somebody I knew had died, and it felt very strange. I had never loved my sister because of her terrible treatment of me before she was attacked. However, it was difficult to think of the house without her in it. I wrote to Joe and told him that I would come for the funeral. On Monday morning, I took the coach to our town and walked to the forge, trying to think of only kind thoughts of my sister as I went. When I arrived at the house, I found Trabb the tailor preparing everybody for the funeral by dressing them in black. Joe was sitting alone in a corner of the best room, and I went to him. "Pip," he said, "you knew her when she was still." He could say no more. He merely took my hand and held it for a while. Biddy was wearing a black dress and was quietly helping people to prepare for the funeral. Uncle Pumblechook came and shook my hand, and I spied Mr. and Mrs. Hubble in another corner of the room. When everything was ready, we all walked out of the house together, carrying the coffin toward the churchyard. Many people stood on the side of the road to watch us go by. Uncle Pumblechook annoyed me by always straightening my hat as we walked along. My sister was buried with my father Philip Pirrup, and my mother Georgiana, wife of the above, and all of my brothers. After the funeral, Biddy, Joe, and I had a cold dinner, and I asked Joe if I could sleep in my own little room that night, which seemed to please Joe very much. In the evening, Biddy and I strolled in the garden and talked. It was a difficult conversation. She told me that she was going to teach in a new school, and then she told me how my sister had died a very quiet death. I asked her about Orlick, and I discovered that he was still trying to be friendly with her. I promised I would do everything possible to keep him away from her and told her that I would come down often to see Joe. She said nothing, and I had the impression that she did not believe me. The next morning I told Joe that I had to return to London, but that I would return soon and often. "As soon as you like and as often as you like," he said. As Biddy was giving me some breakfast, I told her that I was not angry, but I was hurt. However, as I walked away from the house, I knew that I would not come back and that Biddy had been right. Chapter 13. As Cold as Stone. Herbert and I went from bad to worse and spent more and more money. This continued until I came of age. I would soon be 21 years old, and I expected that Mr. Jaggers would tell me something about my expectations at that time. I received a letter from Wemmick telling me that Mr. Jaggers wanted to see me at 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the day of my birthday. I was very excited and did not know what to expect. I arrived exactly on time, and Wemmick showed me into Mr. Jaggers' office. Mr. Jaggers stood with his back to the fire and congratulated me on my birthday. "Congratulations, Pip," he said. "Now I must call you Mr. Pip." He shook my hand. "Take a seat, Mr. Pip," he said. I sat down. "I am going to have a word with you," he continued. "How much money do you think you are spending every month?" I had to confess that I did not know. "Yes, I thought as much," he said with satisfaction. "Now you may ask me a question." I remembered that I was never to ask who my benefactor was. So now that I had been given permission, I asked, "Will you tell me who my benefactor is today?" "No, ask another question." "Will I know my benefactor soon?" "I will answer that question later. Ask another." "Will I receive anything today?" "Good," he said. He called Wemmick into the room, and Wemmick gave me a banknote for £500, a very large amount of money. "This money is your own money," said Mr. Jaggers. "It is a present from your benefactor. From this day forward, you will look after your own finances. You will have £500 every year until your benefactor is revealed. You will get £125 every 3 months from Wemmick, and he will give you no more. Personally, I do not think it is wise to give you so much money, but I am not being paid to give advice in this matter. I am being paid only to do what I am told." I began to thank him and my benefactor, but Mr. Jaggers stopped me. "I am not paid to deliver your messages to your benefactor," he said. I asked him again whether my benefactor would soon be revealed. "When I first met you, I told you that it would be a long time," he said, "and that is still my answer. When your benefactor is revealed, my job will come to an end. That is all I will say." "If that is all you can say," I said, "there is nothing left for me to say." He asked me where I was going to dine that evening, so I told him that I was going to Barnard's Inn to dine with Herbert and invited him to come. He immediately accepted. While he was finishing his work, I talked to Wemmick, asking him for his advice about helping a friend with some money. "You may as well throw your money in the river," he said. "That is far less trouble." I asked, "Is that really what you think?" He replied, "It is my opinion in this office." I understood what he meant and asked, "What is your opinion in the castle?" "I can only tell you that when I am in the castle," he said. "The office is the office, and the castle is the castle." "Very well," I said. "Then I shall come to see you in the castle." "You will be very welcome," he told me. Mr. Jaggers dined with us at Barnard's Inn, but the dinner was not very enjoyable because Mr. Jaggers was very careful in everything he said and asked so many questions that at last Herbert began to feel like a criminal. Both Herbert and I were relieved when he left. The following Sunday, I went to the castle. When I arrived, the flag was flying and the drawbridge was up, which meant that Wemmick was out. However, his deaf old father let down the drawbridge to let me in. "My son thought you might come today," he said. I nodded at him, and he smiled. Then I tried to ask Wemmick's father about Mr. Jaggers, but he could not understand me even though I shouted. He thought I was trying to tell him something funny. Finally, Wemmick arrived at the castle. He had a lady with him, whom he introduced as Miss Skiffins. She was very much like him, and it soon became clear that she visited the castle every Sunday afternoon. She was just as proud of the castle as the old father and Wemmick himself. Wemmick invited me to walk around the garden with him, and I took this opportunity to explain to him what I wanted to do for poor Herbert. I wanted to help my friend find an opportunity so that he could begin to work and make some money, but I did not want him to know that I was helping him. I explained to Wemmick that Herbert was a good friend and that I had caused him to be in some debt. Wemmick suggested, I think that Miss Skiffin's brother may be able to help." I thanked him, and we went in to have some tea. After tea, Wemmick's old father read the newspaper aloud, and we all nodded at him whenever he looked up, which pleased him greatly. A week later I had a letter from Wemmick, which said that Mr. Skiffins knew somebody who wanted an assistant and some capital. I paid half my £500 to him, and he agreed to take Herbert as his assistant. One day soon after that, Herbert came home very excited and told me that he had met a man called Clarriker, who was very interested in him and agreed to give him a position. It made me very happy to realize that at last I had done something good with my money. We are now coming to the most important event in my life, when everything changed. However, before I say what it is, I must tell you more about Estella. I had been visiting the house in Richmond quite often, but I thought about the house and its occupants even more often. Mrs. Branley was the owner of the house, and she lived there with her daughter, who was several years older than Estella. Estella caused me every kind of suffering in and out of that house. Sometimes she was friendly to me, but at other times she would use me to tease her many other admirers. Although I went to Richmond for boating parties and picnics and spent evenings out on the town with Estella at the theater and the opera, I never had one happy hour with her. I found myself unhappy without her and unhappy with her, because she always made me feel that she was enduring me only because of Miss Havisham's orders. Again and again she asked, "Will you never listen to the warning?" I said that I did not know what she meant, and she told me that I was blind. Miss Havisham asked Estella to come home with me for a visit, and we went down together in a coach. Of course, nothing had changed. Miss Havisham still wore her wedding dress and still wanted me to push her around the wedding cake. In the evening, she sat by the fire and stared at Estella as they talked together. I knew that Miss Havisham was preparing Estella to take revenge on men. Perhaps, I tried to convince myself, she will be mine some day, but she wants to make other men suffer as much as possible first. Of course, this made me suffer as well. The candles in that room cast long shadows on the walls, and I looked around at the wedding dress, the stopped clocks, and the cobwebs and spiders. It was a strange place. Then I heard Estella and Miss Havisham argue, which had never happened before. Miss Havisham was holding Estella's hand, but Estella pulled her hand away. Miss Havisham asked in surprise, "What, are you tired of me?" "No, only a little tired of myself," replied Estella. Hitting the floor with her stick, Miss Havisham demanded, "Tell me the truth. You are tired of me." Estella did not answer, except to look at her. Miss Havisham exclaimed, "You are as cold as stone. Your heart is cold and hard." "I am only what you have made me," replied Estella. "My success is your success, and my failure is your failure." Still shouting, Miss Havisham cried, "You are ungrateful for what I have given you. Why don't you give me love?" "I can only give you what you have given me," answered Estella calmly. I left the room and went to my bed. This was the first time I slept at Miss Havisham's house. I could not sleep that night and walked about in the dark house. In her room, I could hear Miss Havisham walking about as well and making sad noises. I did not want her to see me and went back to my bedroom. The next morning, Miss Havisham and Estella appeared the same as always. Neither gave any sign that they had quarreled, and that day Estella and I returned to London. Back in London, I went to a dinner with the Finches of the Grove. Drummle, that awful student of Mr. Pocket that Mr. Jaggers liked so much, had joined this group, and at this dinner he spoke about Estella, commenting on what a beautiful lady she was. He told everyone that he had danced with her several times, which angered me, so we argued. I spoke to Estella about him, but she merely said that she could dance with any man she liked. "Moths and all sorts of ugly things come to the light of a candle," she said. "Is it the candle's fault?" "No," I replied. "But can't you help it?" "Well," she said, laughing, and then after a moment replied, "Perhaps. Yes, anything you like." "You look at him in ways that you never look at me," I complained. She asked me, Do you want me to deceive you as I deceive all the others? Do you deceive him, Estella? Yes, and many others, all of them except you. Chapter 14. How I Met My Benefactor. The most important event in my life happened when I was 23 years old. I was no longer studying with Mr. Pocket, although we remained friends. Herbert and I had left Barnard's Inn and moved to a better flat in the Temple. One stormy night, I was sitting alone in our flat because Herbert had gone to France for business. At 11 o'clock, just as I put down the book that I was reading to go to bed, I heard somebody on the stairs outside. I opened the door, but it was very dark, so I could not see anybody. I called out, and a man answered saying he was looking for Mr. Pip. I asked the man, "Is anything the matter?" "No, nothing the matter," he answered. When he came to the top of the stairs, I could see by the light of a small candle that I held that he was about 60 years old and very strong. His face was quite brown and hard, like a man who had spent a lot of time outdoors. As he approached the top of the stairs, I asked, "What do you want?" "I will tell you," he said, "if you allow me to come in." He came into the flat and looked around, admiring the furniture. Then he held out both his hands to me. Suspecting he might be mad, I asked cautiously, "What do you mean?" "This is disappointing," he said. "I have come a long way, and I was looking forward to this moment. However, it's not your fault. It's not mine either." He sat down on a chair near the fire and covered his face with his hands. When he looked up, he asked me, "Is there anyone else in the flat?" Without answering, I asked in return, "Why do you, a stranger, come into my flat at this time of the night and ask me such a question?" The old man beamed. "You've grown up." Suddenly, I recognized him as my convict from the marshes. I could still picture him in the churchyard, asking me to help him. He came toward me, holding out both his hands again, and this time I gave him my hands. I hardly knew what I was doing because I was so surprised. He kissed my hands. "You were very good to me, my boy, and I have never forgotten your kindness." I could see that he was about to hug me, so I pushed him away. I said, "I am pleased that you are grateful for my help when I was a little child. I hope you show your gratitude to others now by living a better life. It was not necessary for you to come here and thank me. You must understand that I do not wish to be your friend, but I can see that you are very wet from the storm. Would you like a drink before you go?" "Yes, please," he said. I made a drink, but when I brought the glass to him, I was amazed to see that his eyes were full of tears. Until then, I had remained standing to show him that I wanted him to leave, but now I felt sorry that I had been so harsh in my words and actions. I sat down. "I'm sorry if I was acting cruelly," I said. "I did not mean it. I wish you well." He drank. I asked him, "How are you living?" "I have been a sheep farmer and many other things in the New World, thousands of miles across the ocean from here," he replied. "I hope you have done well," I said. "I have done very well," he replied. "Other people have done well too, but nobody has done as well as I have. I am famous for it." "I am glad to hear it," I said. I suddenly remembered the 2 one-pound notes that his friend had given me, and I told the old man sitting how grateful I was. I took out my wallet and handed him 2 one-pound notes. The old man picked them up, looked at them, and then tossed them into the fire. Watching the pound notes burn, he asked, "May I ask how you have done so well since you were a boy on the marshes?" A chill ran through me, and I began to be afraid. I did not want to tell him. "Somebody chose me to receive some property," I finally said. "May I ask what property?" "I don't know." "May I ask whose property?" "I don't know." I was beginning to feel very uncomfortable. "May I guess at your income? Does it start with a 5? My heart was beating like a hammer as I stood up and stared at the convict. "May I guess at your guardian? Does his name begin with J?" I realized the awful truth of my position and could hardly breathe. As he went on to speak of Mr. Jaggers and Wemmick, I could not speak at all. The room began to dance around me, so I took hold of a chair. The old man came to me and helped me to sit down. "Yes, Pip, my dear boy," he said. "I have made a gentleman of you. I did it. I worked hard and lived in difficulty so that you could be a gentleman. I wanted you to know that the man who was hunted like a dog could make a gentleman, and you are him. I hated him. I was afraid of him. I wanted to run away from him. Pip," he said, "I am like your second father, and you are like a son to me." I noticed his glance toward my gold watch and my books. He exclaimed, "Hundreds of books. You will read them to me." I was silent. "You don't have to speak, Pip," he said. "You have not looked forward to this day as I have. You never thought your benefactor might be me." "No, no, never," I said. "Well, it was me. After I got a job looking after sheep, my master died and I got his money. I did some business with it, and from that time on, everything I did made more money. I was very lucky and very successful. People laughed at me because I wasn't a gentleman, but little did they know that I was making a gentleman in London." Then he informed me that I was now obliged to hide him and keep him safe because as a convict, he was not legally allowed to return to England. Should the police catch him, they would hang him. Not knowing what else to do, I gave him some food and put him in Herbert's room for the night. It was the worst night of my life. Everything I had hoped was nothing more than a dream. Miss Havisham was not my benefactor. Estella was not for me. Worst of all, it was for a convict that I had left Joe and Biddy. I felt that I could never go back to them. I sat by the fire feeling awful about my situation until my eyes closed and I slowly slid onto the floor and slept. Waking early while it was still cold and dark, I tried to make a plan. Herbert would not be back for 2 or 3 days. An old woman and her niece came in every morning to make the breakfast and tidy the flat, so I decided to tell them that the convict was my uncle. I looked around for a light because I wanted to step out of the flat, but I could not find one. I went out anyway, and as I crept downstairs, I fell over a man who was hiding in a corner. He ran off without speaking before I could get back to my feet. I told the watchman about the intruder, and together we examined the stairs from top to bottom, but could not find him. I mentioned my uncle to the watchman, and he told me that another man had come into the building just after my uncle. This news made me quite anxious. Later that morning, the old woman and her niece arrived. I told them that my uncle from the country had arrived during the night, and they made an extra breakfast. When they had gone, my benefactor came out of his room, and I told him that he was to be my uncle, which pleased him. He told me that his real name was Abel Magwitch, but he was presently using the name Provis. I asked, "Did another man come into the building with you last night?" "I think there was somebody, but I did not take notice of him," was his reply. He ate his breakfast greedily like a dog, and then took out his pipe for a smoke. Magwitch explained to me that he did not intend to return to the New World. He felt very secure because he did not think that anybody would find him, since very few people knew that he was in England. There were only Mr. Jaggers, Wemmick, and myself. I bought some clothes for him and found some rooms for him in another building nearby. Then I went to see Mr. Jaggers. Mr. Jaggers seemed prepared for my visit and told me, "Don't tell me anything. I don't want to know." Then he told me that Abel Magwitch was my benefactor and that Miss Havisham was not. Of course, I already knew this was true, but I wanted to hear him say it. I went back to the flat and dressed Provis in the clothes I bought for him. They looked terrible because he did not know how to wear fine clothes. We stayed together in the flat for 5 days, during which he made me read books to him or play cards. I did not dare to take him outside. I was waiting for Herbert to return. Provis agreed that Herbert would have to know the truth. When Herbert arrived, he was very surprised to see Provis in the flat, and was even more surprised when I told him the story of my great expectations. Chapter 15. Estella's marriage plans. Late that night, after I had taken Magwitch to his own flat, just around the corner, I returned to my flat and asked Herbert, "What can we do?" "I don't know," replied my friend. "I am still too shocked to think clearly." "He wants to spend more money," I told Herbert. "He wants to buy things like horses and carriages. I cannot accept money from him." "My poor dear Handel," said Herbert. "Not only that," I continued, "I am in debt, and now I have no expectations. I have not learned any job. I am useless." Herbert asked, "What will he do if you refuse to accept his money? He has come across the ocean and is risking his life to see the gentleman he has made. If you disappoint him, he may do something bad." "I agree," I answered, "and then the police will find him and hang him. We do not want that to happen." "We must get him out of England," said Herbert. We agreed that this was the best plan. The next morning, Magwitch came to our flat for breakfast, and I asked him about his life. I wanted to know about the other convict who was in the marshes that night. This is the story he told us. "My whole life has been in and out of jail. I cannot remember a father or a mother. The first thing I remember is stealing food from gardens and being cold. I had to eat. Sometimes I stole. Sometimes I begged. Sometimes I worked, and sometimes I was in jail. This was how I grew to manhood. Then I met a man called Compeyson. I would kill him now if he were here. He was the other convict in the marshes. He always dressed like a gentleman and cheated ladies and gentlemen into giving him money. I became his helper. He had a friend called Arthur, and they had cheated a rich lady and made a lot of money from it. Arthur and Compeyson wasted the money, and Arthur kept having nightmares about a woman who was chasing him. I was there the night he died. He was terribly frightened by the woman in his dreams. After Arthur died, Compeyson made me work harder for him. I always owed him money. Then the police caught us. At the trial, Compeyson made it look like I was the mastermind of our crimes. I told him that when we got out of court, I would break his head. Compeyson asked the judge to protect him. In the end, the judge gave him 7 years in prison, but he gave me 14. We were on the same hulk together, and I was about to beat him up when a guard stopped me. I escaped and swam to shore. That's where I met you, Pip. When you told me that another convict had escaped, I knew it was Compeyson. I did not want him to go free, so I caught him and held on to him until the police arrived. That meant I would go back to prison too, but I didn't care. I could not let Compeyson escape. They sent me to Australia for life, but I didn't stay there, as you can see. Magwitch pulled his pipe from his pocket and began to smoke. I asked, "Is Compeyson dead?" "I never heard any more about him," said Magwitch. After listening carefully to the story, Herbert wrote something on a piece of paper and gave it to me while Magwitch was looking into the fire. On the paper I read, Arthur was Miss Havisham's half-brother, and Compeyson was the man she loved. I said nothing, and we both looked at Magwitch as he stood smoking by the fire. I realized that if Compeyson knew that Magwitch was in England, he would surely tell the police. Then Magwitch would be caught and hanged. We had to hide him. I thought about Estella and how I would never be good enough for her now. I had lost my expectations, and I was hiding a convict who had been my benefactor. I told Herbert that I had to see Estella and Miss Havisham before I could leave England with Magwitch. I went to Richmond, but they told me that Estella had gone to her mother. I was very surprised because it was the first time she had gone without me. I asked if anyone knew when she would return, but the maid told me she did not expect Estella to return at all, except for a short visit. I was puzzled. The next day I took an early coach to see Miss Havisham. It was another cold, wet morning, and I was glad when I finally arrived at the hotel where I would stay. I was not glad for long. In the hotel I found Bentley Drummle, who pretended not to see me, so I pretended not to see him. It was very silly. I sat at a table waiting for my breakfast while he stood at the fire. However, because I was cold, I finally got up and stood next to him at the fire. Drummle asked, "Am I invisible?" Attempting to act surprised, I said, "Oh, it's you." I wondered who was blocking the warmth. Drummle asked, "Have you just arrived?" He nudged me away from the fire with his shoulder. "Yes," I said, nudging him away with my shoulder. "Terrible place," said Drummle. "Isn't this where you come from?" "Yes," I admitted. "It's just like your Shropshire." "Not at all," he replied. He looked at his boots. I looked at mine. He looked at my boots. I looked at his. I asked, "Have you been here long?" "Long enough to be bored with it," he replied. "How long will you stay?" "I don't know. How long will you stay?" "I don't know." Drummle called the waiter and asked, "Is my horse ready?" "It's waiting at the door," said the waiter. "The lady won't ride today," said Drummle. "It is too cold." "Very good, sir," said the waiter. "And I won't be here for dinner," continued Drummle. "I am dining with the lady." He smiled at me in a very unpleasant way. His horse was standing at the door, but he would not leave the fire. My breakfast was on the table, but I would not leave the fire either. Drummle asked, "Have you dined with the Finches lately?" "No," I replied. "You should not have lost your temper," he said. "I did not invite this conversation," I replied. "I suggest that we have no further conversations in the future." "I agree," said Drummle, "but don't lose your temper again. You have lost it enough already." "What do you mean?" To answer me, he called the waiter and reminded him that he was dining with a young lady that day. Then he and I stood at the fire not speaking until 3 farmers came in and we had to move. When Drummle went out to his horse, I noticed that the man who had helped him looked like Orlick. I decided not to eat breakfast and instead went to Miss Havisham's house. I found Miss Havisham in the room where I had first been introduced to her. Estella was there too. Miss Havisham was sitting near the fire and Estella was knitting on a cushion at her feet. Miss Havisham asked me, "What brings you here?" "I went to Richmond yesterday and learned that Estella had come here, so I followed her," I answered. "I have met my benefactor. It was not a pleasant meeting, and my expectations appear to be gone. I can say no more about it because it is another's secret. I will say that I thought you were my benefactor, and you let me believe it, though you knew I was wrong. I do not complain. You paid for my apprenticeship, and that was enough." I could see that Estella was listening intently, but she did not look at me. She continued to knit. I explained to Miss Havisham that Matthew and Herbert Pocket were different from their relatives, and they had become my friends even when they thought I had taken their place. Camilla, Georgiana, and Sarah Pocket had only hated me. I asked Miss Havisham if she would help Herbert with some money, and explained to her that it must be a secret, because I had secretly given money at first, but I could not complete the work now because my expectations were gone. Miss Havisham gazed into the fire and remained silent. When she finally turned to me, she only asked, "What else?" Looking at Estella, I said, "Estella, you know that I love you and that I have loved you for a long time." Estella looked up at me while continuing to knit without speaking. "I should have told you that before," I said, "but I thought that Miss Havisham intended you for me. I was wrong. I can never call you mine because I do not know what will happen to me now. I may become very poor. Still, I love you the same as I have always loved you." "I do not understand love," said Estella. "I tried to warn you." "I know," I said, "but I could not believe it. I hope that you did not mean it." I asked her about Drummle. She was surprised that I knew he was there. I asked her if she loved him and if she would marry him. She admitted she would marry him. I begged her not to do it. "Do not let Miss Havisham do this to you," I pleaded. "She wants you to marry him so that she can hurt many other men who are better than him. Please, marry somebody better than Drummle." "I am going to marry Drummle," she said calmly. "It is not Miss Havisham's plan. It is mine. I do not like the life I have now, and I want to change it." With tears in my eyes, I told her, "He is so mean and stupid. You cannot give yourself to him." "You will forget it in a week," said Estella. "Never, Estella, never. I cannot stop thinking about you. You hurt me from the start, but I loved you from the start. Every plan I ever made included you. I never stopped thinking about you. You are everything to me. The stones of this building are not more real than my love for you. You cannot destroy these stones, and you cannot destroy my love. You have hurt me, but you have done more good for me than bad. God forgive you. God bless you." I took her hand and kissed it, but she simply looked at me in surprise. Miss Havisham glared at me. I did not know what they thought. I left the house. I did not want to see Drummle at the hotel and decided to walk all the way back to London. It was a very long walk, and it was well past midnight when I crossed London Bridge. As I came to my flat, the watchman gave me a note from Wemmick. The note said, "Don't go home." Chapter 16. How I Met Compeyson. As soon as I read Wemmick's note, I turned around and went to a hotel near Covent Garden, where I got a room and spent a long and anxious night. I kept thinking about Estella and Miss Havisham, and I was very worried about the note. What could it mean? Was Herbert safe? Was Magwitch safe? Had Compeyson found Magwitch and told the police? I did not know what to think. The next morning I went to the castle to see Wemmick as soon as I could. While I helped him prepare breakfast for his old father, Wemmick told me what had happened. "I was in a place that I will not name, but where I have once been with you, when I overheard that a person in Australia, who had a lot of property and whose name I do not know, suddenly disappeared with all his money." "I understand," I said. "People were guessing where he might be," Wemmick continued. "They thought he might have returned to England. I also heard that somebody was watching your rooms at the temple." "Who is it?" I asked. "I can't say," Wemmick replied. "May I simply ask some questions?" "You do not have to say anything." Wemmick nodded. I asked him whether he knew of a man named Compeyson. He nodded. I asked whether Compeyson was alive. He nodded. I asked whether Compeyson was in London. He nodded and told me that he had advised Herbert to get any visitors to our rooms out of the way, but to keep them in London. Herbert had taken our visitor to stay with Clara, his fiancée, and her invalid father in their house that looked over the river. It was perfect because I could get news of Magwitch every time that Herbert visited Clara. In addition, when the time was right and we could escape abroad, Magwitch was already on the river, and we could easily use a small boat to get him on a ship without anybody seeing him. Wemmick advised me to stay at the castle and rest until dark, and I agreed. When it was dark, I went down to the river to find the house where Clara lived and where Magwitch was now staying. It was a large house, 3 stories high. Herbert was there, and it was not long before I heard Clara's father shouting and knocking on the ceiling. Herbert took no notice of the noise. "All is well, dear Handel," Herbert assured me. "Provis is happy, but eager to see you." There was more shouting and growling upstairs. I was introduced to Mrs. Wimple, a widow who owned the house and helped to look after Clara and her father. "Clara has no mother," said Herbert, "and Mrs. Wimple is a very good friend. Clara only has her father, Mr. Barley. She has no other relatives. Here she is now." A pretty dark-haired girl came into the room, and Herbert introduced her to me. Suddenly, there was another shout from upstairs. "Father wants me," said Clara, excusing herself. Herbert and I went upstairs to see Magwitch, who was resting very comfortably in his room. He seemed kinder and gentler than before. We told him what Wemmick had said about the rooms being watched, but I thought it best not to say anything about Compeyson. We told Magwitch that the best plan was to leave England secretly when the time was right. Herbert suggested that I should get a boat and keep it near my flat. I should go rowing often so that nobody would think it was unusual to see me on the river. Then I could row Provis to a ship when the time was right. I concurred that this was a very good plan, and we agreed that I would row past the house from time to time, and that Provis would close his curtain whenever he saw me, as a signal that everything was all right. I bought the boat the next day and kept it tied up on the river near my room. As suggested, I went out boating almost every day, sometimes alone and sometimes with Herbert. Whenever I passed Mrs. Wimple's house, Provis closed the curtains, signaling to me that everything was still all right. Several weeks passed as we waited to hear from Wemmick, but he sent no message. I was restless and quite anxious during this time. Although I was in debt, I refused to take money from Magwitch, and I could not help imagining that Estella had married. I did not want to know if it was true or not, so I avoided reading the newspapers and asked Herbert never to speak of her to me. Then, of course, there was always Magwitch to worry about. One evening, after rowing down the river and back up it, and seeing Magwitch's signal that he was safe, I decided to go to the theater to watch Mr. Wopsle performing in a comedy. At one time in the play, he had to stand perfectly still while the other actors performed, and I noticed that he looked in my direction. In fact, he seemed to be staring quite openly at me and looked very puzzled. After the play, he was waiting for me at the back door of the theater and told me that he had seen me in the audience. He then went on to say that he had seen a man behind me and had stared long and hard at the man because he was sure that he should know him. "Do you remember one Christmas when you were a little boy?" he asked, "and the soldiers came to hunt some convicts? We went with them and found the 2 convicts fighting in a ditch. Do you remember?" Of course I remembered. How could I forget? "Well," Mr. Wopsle continued, "I am sure that the man sitting behind you in the theater was one of those convicts." This gave me quite a chill, since I was sure that Magwitch could not have followed me to the theater. It must have been Compeyson. Just to be sure, I asked, "Do you know which one you saw tonight?" "Yes, I'm sure it was the one being attacked by the other one, the one trying to get away while the other convict held on to him." "I'm sure it was him. I thought you were together in the theater," said Mr. Wopsle, and I was quite surprised. Then I realized that you did not know he was there. It was very strange. He was sitting behind you like a ghost. "That's very strange," I said. "Did you happen to see him leave?" "Actually, I noticed that he left before the play was finished," answered Mr. Wopsle. I asked him a lot of questions about the man, but he could tell me no more except that the man behind me had been dressed like a successful businessman. This entire conversation made me quite anxious, as I became more convinced than ever that it must have been Compeyson. It made me very uncomfortable imagining him sitting behind me like a ghost. When I got home that evening, I told Herbert about it, and then I wrote to Wemmick. I told him what had happened and reminded him that we were waiting for his message. Chapter 17. Can You Forgive Me? About a week after my visit to the theater, I had dinner with Mr. Jaggers and Wemmick. "Did you send that note from Miss Havisham to Pip?" asked Mr. Jaggers. "Not yet," said Wemmick, "but I have it with me." He gave me the note in which Miss Havisham asked me to come down and see her about some business, and I informed Mr. Jaggers and Wemmick that I would go down immediately. Mr. Jaggers began to talk about Drummle. "Our friend seems to have won the lady," he said, "but it will be interesting to see how it turns out." Mr. Jaggers predicted that Drummle and Estella would never be happy, and that Drummle would surely have to resort to beating Estella if he wanted to win the battle between them. If he did not beat her, Estella would rule their home. I found this conversation very unpleasant, and was happy when the housemaid came in to serve the dinner. She put some food on the table and stood waiting for Mr. Jaggers. As she stood, I noticed that she moved her fingers in a way that reminded me of something. I looked at her eyes as she looked at Mr. Jaggers, and realized that I had seen fingers and eyes like that before. I remembered several times when I had seen something in Estella and did not know what it was, and suddenly felt certain that this woman was Estella's mother. She had Estella's hands. She had Estella's eyes. I could not be more certain. After dinner, Wemmick and I left the house together. As soon as we were on the street, Wemmick once again began to behave like my friend from the castle, rather than Mr. Jaggers' employee at the office. I asked him about Mr. Jaggers' housekeeper, Molly. "You once told me she was like a tamed wild animal," I said. "How did Mr. Jaggers tame her?" Wemmick told me her story. About 20 years ago, that woman was on trial for murder, but Mr. Jaggers helped her, and she was found not guilty. It was in fact that very interesting case that made him famous. The murdered person was a woman who was older, bigger, and stronger than Molly. The police claimed that Molly was a jealous woman who became easily angered. The murdered woman was found in a barn, There had obviously been a fight, and the dead woman's body was bruised, scratched, and torn. She had been held by the throat and choked to death. There was no reason to think that anybody other than Molly had done it. The police said that the murdered woman must have been too friendly with Molly's husband, and that Molly became jealous and killed her. Mr. Jaggers argued that she could not have done it because she was not strong enough. He said nothing about her strong hands during the trial, though he often mentions them now. I remembered that he showed us her hands when I first went to his house for dinner, and that they had scars on them. Mr. Jaggers made sure that she was dressed for the trial in a way that made her look weaker than she was, continued Wemmick. Her hands had many cuts on them, and Mr. Jaggers explained the cuts by saying that she had tried to walk through a lot of brambles, which had scratched her. Pieces of bramble were in fact found in her skin and clothes. The police said that Molly had a 3-year-old daughter, but had killed her because she was so angry with her husband. No proof of the daughter could be found, so in the end, Mr. Jaggers won. Molly was found not guilty, and she has been his housekeeper since that day. While considering all that I had learned, I asked Herbert if he thought it was safe to take Magwitch out of the country yet. No, he replied. I received your note last week and burned it. There is nothing more to say now. We said good night to each other and I went home. I had a lot to think about. The next day I went down by coach to Miss Havisham's house. I got off the coach before it reached the town and walked the rest of the way because I did not want people to see me coming into town. I avoided the main roads. When I arrived at the house, I found Miss Havisham in her usual room, sitting near the fire. She looked very lonely, and I could not help feeling sorry for her, even though she had ruined my life. I told her, Mr. Jaggers gave me your note yesterday, so I came immediately. Thank you, she said. She looked afraid of me for some reason. Quite unexpectedly, she told me, I want to help your friend. I want to prove that I am not all stone. I am human. What can I do? I explained the situation carefully, but she did not listen very well, and I had to explain it again. When I had finished, she asked me how much money was needed. I was almost afraid to say it because it was a lot of money. £900, I said. She wrote a note for Mr. Jaggers and gave it to me. Then she asked me, Are you very unhappy? I am certainly not happy, Miss Havisham, I replied, but I have more reasons than you know about. I cannot tell them to you because they are another person's secrets. She asked, Is there anything I can do to help you? No, I said, there is nothing. Then, almost shaking with fear, she asked, Can you forgive me? Of course, Miss Havisham, I replied. I am too much in need of forgiveness myself to refuse it to you. Suddenly, she fell at my feet and began to cry. What have I done? What have I done? She repeated this over and over. I looked at her and thought about how she had brought such suffering on herself, as well as upon me and Estella. I wanted to help her, Miss Havisham said, looking up at me from the floor. I wanted her to be harder than I was, so that her heart would not break like mine. If you knew my story, you would pity me more than any other person on earth. I told her that I did pity her, because I already knew her story, but I wanted to ask about Estella. I asked Miss Havisham, who was her mother? I don't know, she answered. I wanted a girl to love and raise, so I asked Mr. Jaggers if he could find an orphan girl for me. One day he brought her here asleep, and I called her Estella. She was about 3 years old then. She began to cry again, so I left her and went outside. I walked around the garden where I had fought with Herbert, and walked around the old brewery where Estella had given me food. I remembered that I had seen Miss Havisham hanging in the brewery on my first visit there, and felt a chill. I went back inside to say goodbye, and found Miss Havisham sitting by the fire again. As I came into the room, she moved too close to the fire, and the hem of her dress burst into flames. Miss Havisham leapt to her feet and ran toward me screaming. I threw my coat over her and pulled the tablecloth over her as well to try and put out the fire. She fought against me, but I pulled her to the floor. I held on to her in the smoky room until a servant came to help. As I held her wrapped in the tablecloth, pieces of her dress flew burning through the air and fell to the floor as black ashes. Finally, all of the flames died out, but I continued to hold her until the doctor came. He laid her on the table that she had once hit with her stick. After examining her, the doctor explained that she was badly burned, but that he expected her to survive. Then I noticed that my own hands and arms were burned. The doctor put bandages on them. I learned from the servants that Estella had gone to Paris, and the doctor promised that he would write to her for me. On my part, I promised to tell the rest of the family what had happened when I returned to London. Miss Havisham began to whisper, saying, "What have I done? I wanted to help her. Can you forgive me?" She whispered these words over and over again. When I returned to London the next morning, Herbert was anxious about my burns and helped me to rebandage them, which was a very painful process. As he changed the bandages, Herbert told me that he had a long conversation with Magwitch. Magwitch told him about a very jealous woman that he once knew who had murdered another woman. Mr. Jaggers had helped her, and she was found not guilty. Magwitch and the woman whom Mr. Jaggers had helped had a baby girl. He loved this girl, but the woman was so angry with him that she said she would kill the baby and took it away. He loved the baby, but he never saw her again. The baby was never found. After the trial, the woman disappeared, so he lost the child and its mother. Compeyson knew about this and used it to make Magwitch work for him. This is how I discovered that my benefactor, the convict Magwitch, was Estella's father. Chapter 18. Orlick's Attack. The next morning when I went to Little Britain to see Mr. Jaggers, I found him looking at some papers with Wemmick. They wanted to know all about the fire and Miss Havisham, and listened carefully as I told them about what had happened. When I had finished, I gave Mr. Jaggers the letter from Miss Havisham. He read it and told Wemmick to write a check for £900. I received the check gratefully and put it in my pocket. "It is a pity," said Mr. Jaggers, "that we do nothing for you, Pip." Miss Havisham was good enough to ask me, but I said no, I said. "That is not what I would have said," said Mr. Jaggers, "but every man must know his own business best." "I did ask her about her daughter, however," I continued. "She told me what she knew." "That is not what I would have done," said Mr. Jaggers, "but every woman must know her own business best as well." "I know more about her daughter than she knows herself," I added. "I know who her real mother is." Mr. Jaggers looked at me with a blank expression. "I have seen her recently, and so have you," I said. "I think I know more of Estella's history than even you do because I know who her father is as well." Mr. Jaggers was surprised, though he hid it very well. I was sure that he did not know who Estella's father was. I confided in them by telling them, "His name is Provis." No longer able to conceal his surprise, Mr. Jaggers exclaimed, "How do you know? What evidence do you have of this? Did he tell you that?" "No," I replied. "He did not tell me. He thinks that his daughter is dead." As I told him all that I knew of the story, Mr. Jaggers looked at me without speaking. Then he turned to Wemmick and said, "Let us continue with our papers, Wemmick." But I could not let it rest there. I begged Mr. Jaggers to tell me what he knew and told him about my love for Estella. Mr. Jaggers stood silent, so I turned to Wemmick. "Wemmick, you are a kind man. I have seen your house and your old father, and your playful ways when you are not in the office. Please, ask Mr. Jaggers to tell me what he knows." Mr. Jaggers looked at Wemmick very strangely. Then he smiled and asked, "What is this about your old father and your playful ways?" "I don't talk about them at the office," said Wemmick. "If they do not stop me from doing my work, why should I not have them?" Mr. Jaggers continued to smile and turned to me. "I will present a case, but I admit nothing. Do you understand?" I said I understood. "Let us imagine," Mr. Jaggers began, "that a woman was hiding a baby, but had to tell her lawyer because he needed to know the truth. Suppose that the lawyer had just received a request from a rich lady to find a girl whom she could adopt. Suppose that the lawyer saw many children in his work and that these children were always badly treated. He might think that he could save one pretty little baby girl from that life. Suppose that he told her mother that he would help her only if she let him have the girl in order to save her. Suppose that the woman agreed and was found not guilty, and suppose that the lawyer needed a housekeeper. Imagine also that the girl grew up to be a beautiful lady and that she married for money. Suppose that her mother and father are both still living and that we are the only people who know their secret. In fact, they do not know it themselves. Imagine everything very carefully. Would revealing the truth now help anybody? Wemmick put his finger on his lips, and I did the same. "Now, Wemmick," said Mr. Jaggers, "let us go on with our papers." I watched them for a few moments, and then I left the office and went to see Miss Skiffin's brother. We went together to see Mr. Clarriker in order to finalize the arrangements for Herbert. Mr. Clarriker told me that he wanted to open an office in Egypt and that Herbert would go there to manage it. My arm slowly improved, though my left arm was still so bad that I could not wear a coat. On a Monday morning I received a letter from Wemmick, which said that the time was right. After I showed the letter to Herbert, I put it in the fire. My arm was too bad to row a boat, so Herbert suggested that we should ask Startop, our old student friend, to help us. This was our plan. Herbert would go and ask Startop to help us, while I got the necessary papers to leave the country. Together we would go down the river on Tuesday and pick up Magwitch. We would continue down the river and find a quiet place where we could stay the night. On Wednesday, we would row along the river again and meet a steamer that was going to Hamburg. Magwitch and I would get on board the steamer. That afternoon I received another note. This is what it said. "If you are not afraid to come to the marshes tonight, I will give you some important information about your Uncle Provis. Come to the lime kiln, tell nobody, and come alone. Bring this note with you." I did not know who wrote the note. I had to make a quick decision because the coach was leaving soon, and I had to be on it if I wanted to reach the marshes that night. Perhaps the information was important. I decided to go and wrote a note for Herbert, explaining to him that I wanted to see Miss Havisham before I left. Then I rushed to the coach and got on it. I was the only passenger in the coach. As I rode along, I began to wonder whether I was doing the right thing and hoped that the information would help Magwitch in some way. It was dark by the time the coach arrived. I went to a hotel and ordered some dinner. While they were cooking it, I dropped by Miss Havisham's house, where the maid told me that she was improving, but still very ill. During dinner, the waiter told me about a young man who used to live in the town but had received great expectations. Now, whenever he came back to the town, he refused to visit his best helper and friend, Mr. Pumblechook. Of course, he did not realize that I was that young man, but his words made me feel guilty about never visiting Joe, who really was my best helper and friend. I thought about reading the note again, but when I checked my pocket, it wasn't there. I assumed that I had lost it, probably on the floor of the coach. It was a dark night and the wind sounded sad as I went on to the marshes. I came to the lime kiln and knocked on the door of the hut. Nobody answered, but I could see a light inside. I opened the door and went in. I called out, but there was no answer. It began to rain. I stepped closer to look at the candle to estimate how long it had been burning. Suddenly, a slight breeze from behind me blew the candle out, and the next moment I felt a rope go over my head and around my body. A rough voice from behind me said, "Now I've got you." I could not move my arms and the rope scratched against my injured arm. I shouted in pain. The voice ordered, "Don't shout again, or I will kill you." As the candle was lit again, I saw Orlick and knew that I was in real danger. I told him to let me go, but he took no notice. "You have been my enemy for a long time," Orlick said as he showed me a gun. It was the one he had carried when he worked for Miss Havisham. "You took my job away from me," he said, "and took Biddy away from me. I am going to kill you now, and nobody will ever find your body because I am going to put it in the lime kiln." I felt that I was on the edge of my grave, but I refused to beg him for my life. I would die making every effort to stop him. Then Orlick told me that he was the person who hit my sister with the iron ring. He had a bottle and began to drink. I knew he was trying to get up enough courage to kill me. Then he told me that he was the one I fell over outside my rooms on the night that Magwitch first arrived. "You wonder why I was there," he said, "and I tell you that I have new friends now who look after me if I look after them. I know what you are doing. I know that you are trying to take your uncle out of the country in secret, and I know his name is Magwitch, and I know that Compeyson would kill him." Orlick picked up the bottle and drank again. Then he picked up a heavy hammer and started toward me. Instead of begging for my life, I shouted and struggled against the rope. Suddenly I heard other shouts, and the door was thrown open. Orlick jumped out of the window into the dark night, and I fell to the floor of the hut. The next thing I saw was the face of Tramp's boy. "I think he is all right," he said. Then I saw Herbert and Startop. Herbert told me that I had dropped the note before leaving the room, and he had found it. Then he saw the note I wrote for him. The 2 notes worried him, so he and Startop hired a carriage and came to look for me. Tramp's boy helped them find the lime kiln. The 4 of us thought about chasing Orlick, but there was no time. We had to go back to London and get some rest before our escape from England. Chapter 19. How Compeyson Won. I rested in my room until Wednesday morning, the day of our planned escape from England. My arm was still sore, and I could not row, so Herbert and Startop rowed while I steered. On the river, we passed under London Bridge and saw many ships along the river preparing to depart for different parts of the world. We watched carefully to see if we were being followed, but we saw nothing to make us suspicious. We came to the mill pond stairs, where we found Magwitch waiting for us. We took him on board and continued down the river. Magwitch was very pleased and grateful to see us, and appeared the least anxious of any of us. "It is such a pleasure," Magwitch said, smoking his pipe, "to sit here on the river with my boy. I have spent too many days in a room surrounded by 4 walls." "If everything goes well," I said, "you will soon be safe." "I hope so," he said, "though it is as difficult to see the future as it is to see the bottom of this river." We had brought some food and drink with us, and landed on shore in a flat, marshy country to eat, drink, and rest. Further down the river, the banks became muddy and the rowing was more difficult because the tide was turning. Herbert and Startop rowed until it began to grow dark and quite cold. Finally, we saw the roof and the light of a hotel on the riverbank. We came ashore, pulled the boat completely out of the water, and went into the hotel. As we ate our meal by the warm fire, the waiter asked us whether we had seen the 4-oared galley carrying beer that had come ashore. He thought they were looking for something, which worried us, and we wondered what we should do. We decided that we would stay at the hotel until an hour or 2 before the steamer was due, to pass at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. I woke during the night, and glancing out of the window in the direction of our boat, I could see the shadows of 2 men looking at the boat. Then they walked away across the marshes. I wanted to call Herbert and Startop, but remembered that they were tired after rowing all day. I also realized that there was nothing we could really do at that hour of the night. When I told the others at breakfast about what I had seen, we decided to change our plan. Magwitch and I departed the hotel and walked further along the bank of the river, while Herbert and Startop stayed at the hotel. As the time for the steamer drew near, they got into the boat and rowed down the river to meet us. We got into the boat and went out into the river to wait for the steamer. It was late. Just as we saw the steamer coming toward us, a 4-oared galley came out from the bank headed in our direction. The steamer was very close by the time that the galley came up beside our boat. The men on the galley took hold of the side of the boat, and one of the men on the galley ordered us to hand over an escaped convict called Magwitch. A police officer in the galley took hold of Magwitch, but Magwitch suddenly leapt toward one of the men in the galley, trying to hit him. I saw that it was Compeyson. The next moment the steamer hit our boat, and it began to sink. It was several minutes before somebody pulled me from the water and onto the galley. Herbert and Startop were there, but Magwitch and Compeyson were missing. Someone on the galley spied Magwitch swimming toward the shore, so they caught up to him and pulled him onto the galley. We searched for Compeyson, but could not find him. The police took us back to the hotel and waited with us for the tide to turn. Magwitch had a deep cut on his head and another on his chest from the crash, and his clothes were completely soaked. He told me that he had fought with Compeyson under the water and hid his head under the steamer. The police allowed me to give him some dry clothes and bandage his injuries. Something inside of me made me realize that Magwitch had been a better friend to me than I had been to Joe, and I decided that I should care for Magwitch until he died. The next day, back in London, I went to see Mr. Jaggers, who told me what I already knew. Nothing could save Magwitch from hanging. While we were waiting for the trial, we received news that Compeyson's body had been found in the river. A week later, Herbert came and told me that he must soon go to Egypt and take up his new position there. He asked me whether I had thought about my future and offered me a place in his new office. I told him that I could not decide what to do until the trial was finished. I told him that I would decide in 2 or 3 months, and he was happy to wait. On Saturday of that week, Herbert left. Wemmick came to visit me and told me that Compeyson had tricked him. Wemmick had waited until he heard that Compeyson was away from London, and then he sent me the letter telling me that the time for our escape was right. However, it turned out that Compeyson was not away at all because he had changed his mind about leaving London at the last minute. In this way, Wemmick received the wrong information and sent me the letter at the wrong time. Then Wemmick invited me to go for a walk with him the following Monday. Although I was not feeling very well, I agreed to go with him. I was surprised to see that he brought a fishing rod with him. I asked him, "Are we going fishing?" "No," he replied. "I just like to carry one when I'm walking." We walked to a small village where we passed a small church. Wemmick turned to me and suggested, "Let's go in." He put down his fishing rod and pulled 2 pairs of white gloves out of his pockets. Handing me one of the pairs of gloves, he said, "Be a good fellow, and put these on." We put on the gloves and then I followed him into the church. I could clearly tell that the church was set up for a wedding ceremony. Wemmick's old father and Miss Skiffins came in by another door. Then Wemmick announced, "Welcome to our wedding." After the wedding, we all had a lovely meal together in a hotel. "Please, do not talk about this at the office," said Wemmick. I promised him that I would not. Magwitch was very ill in prison, and I visited him every day. The trial was very brief, and he was quickly found guilty of returning to England and sentenced to death, as we all expected. In all, 32 people were sentenced to death that day. Some of them shouted, some of them cried, and some of them simply remained silent. Magwitch told the judge that he had already received a sentence of death from God, which was his illness. Because he was too ill to stay in the prison, the doctor put him in the hospital, where I continued to visit him every day. Although he was always cheerful and pleased to see me, every day I could tell that he was obviously getting worse. Before he died, I told him that his daughter was alive, that she was rich, and that I had loved her. It was the last thing he heard. Chapter 20. We Are Friends. I was alone. Herbert was in Egypt, and Magwitch was dead. I was in debt and had no money. Then, to make matters worse, I became ill and lay in my bed, having nightmare after nightmare. I dreamed about Miss Havisham with her burning dress, and about Orlick trying to kill me at the lime kiln. I dreamed about steamers and sinking boats, and the judge sentencing people to death. I cannot recall how long I was ill, but it must have been for a long time. Once I woke up to find 2 men standing near my bed, claiming that I owed them money, and calling for my arrest. However, I could not get out of bed, and eventually they went away. Later, I was not sure whether this had been real or a dream. One time I woke up to find Joe sitting by my bed. I thought it must be a dream and went back to sleep, but this happened several times. At last, I decided to try and speak to him and discovered that he was not a dream at all. He was real. He had heard that I was sick and had come to London to look after me. I also soon discovered that Biddy had taught him how to write because I watched him write her a letter. While I was recovering from my illness, Joe told me what had happened in our old town. Miss Havisham had died and left most of her money to Estella, but Matthew Pocket received £4,000, while the other Pockets all received very small amounts of money. Orlick was now in prison after he and his friends had been caught by the police. Orlick had broken into Uncle Pumblechook's house, tied him up, beat him, and pulled his nose, and stolen money from him. Joe and I talked about my sister, and he apologized for all the times that he had allowed her to beat me. He thought that if he tried to stop her, she would beat me more. As I got better, Joe began to treat me differently, calling me sir and acting more as if I were a gentleman. We went down in a carriage several times, and soon I was able to walk without his help. One evening, he came to my room to see if I was all right, and when I told him that I was, he looked at me sadly and said goodbye in a strange voice before leaving the room. The next morning, he was gone. He left a note explaining that I obviously no longer needed his help, and in the note was included a receipt for many of the debts I owed, which he had paid in full. I decided to follow him. What else could I do? I also wanted to carry out another plan that I had formed, which was to ask Biddy to marry me. I was very tired when I arrived at the hotel in our town. By this time, people knew that I had lost my fortune and treated me less respectfully. Uncle Pumblechook came and shook my hand, but it was not the same as before. Now, he did it as a favor to me, to show that he was still my friend. Then he told me that he was angry with me for not visiting him more often, and reminded everybody that he was my first and best friend. He told me that I was ungrateful, and that he was not surprised that I had lost my fortune. It was an unpleasant conversation, and I was relieved when he left. I left the hotel and walked to the forge. On the way, I passed the school where Biddy was the teacher, but it was closed. As I approached the forge, I began to wonder why I could not hear the usual noise of Joe working. As it turned out, there was nobody at the forge. I went to the house, and there I found Joe and Biddy, who were both very well dressed for some reason. When they saw me, they were very surprised and happy. "You arrived on my wedding day," said Biddy, "and I am married to Joe." I was actually very happy for them. I was also glad that I had not told Joe about my plan. I thanked them both for everything they had done for me, and asked them to forgive me for all the things I had done wrong. I returned to London that same day. I sold everything I had, and paid back as many of my remaining debts as I could. Within a few weeks, I left England and went to work in Egypt with Herbert. When Clara's invalid father died, he returned to England, married her, and brought her with him to Egypt, where we all lived happily together. Several years later, Clarriker finally told Herbert about the part that I had played in getting Herbert his position. Herbert was surprised, but we were such good friends that it did not matter to him. It was a long time before I saw Joe and Biddy again. During that time, I worked hard and business was good. I was able to pay back all my debts, including the money that Joe had given to cover my debts when he was looking after me. Herbert and I did not run a very big business, but we were good at our jobs and people trusted us. After 11 years, I had the opportunity to go back to England and visit my hometown. I went to the house where I had grown up and found Joe smoking his pipe in the front room. Next to him was a small boy. After we had greeted each other with a warm hug, Joe told me, "We called him Pip, after you." I liked little Pip very much, and he and I went for walks together in the marshes. I showed him the graves of Philip Parrop and Georgiana, wife of the above. Biddy told me that Estella had sold Miss Havisham's house and that it had been torn down and all the pieces taken away. She also told me that Estella's husband had died in an accident with a horse. People said that her marriage had been very unhappy. She asked me if I still thought about Estella. I told her I did not, although this was not really true. That afternoon, I walked to where Miss Havisham's old house had stood. Although I could clearly see where the house had been, there was nothing left except the piece of garden wall. As I stood there on the street, I saw somebody coming toward me. Recognizing that it was Estella, I called out to her. "I am surprised you recognized me," she said. "I have changed." She was still beautiful, but it was true that she was very different. Her eyes were sadder and wiser now, and the old pride had gone. How strange that we should meet here, I said. Where we first met. Do you come here often? It is the first time, she said, since I last saw you. She asked me how I was living, and I explained to her that I was living abroad. I have often thought of you, she admitted. I confessed that she had always been in my heart and added, We are friends. We will continue as friends even apart, she answered. I took her hand and we walked out of the ruined place together.
Playlet. Pip takes Miss Havisham for a walk. Pip is standing alone in a room. In the room is a long table. On the table is a wedding cake that is covered in dust and cobwebs. He is looking at the cake, wondering what it is. He is very nervous. Miss Havisham enters, using a walking stick to help her walk. She is very old. She puts her hand on Pip's shoulder.
Are you ready to work, Pip?
Pip is startled. Yes, Miss Havisham. What shall I do? Miss Havisham hits the table with her stick.
This is where they will lay me down when I am dead, and everybody will come and look at me.
Pip tries to take a step away from the table, but Miss Havisham is still holding his shoulder. Miss Havisham points at the cake with her stick.
What do you think that is?
I can't guess what it is, Miss Havisham.
It's a big cake. It's a wedding cake. It's mine.
Pip looks at the cake. Miss Havisham looks around the room.
Come, walk me.
Pip begins to walk around the room with Miss Havisham leaning on his shoulder and still using her stick to help her walk.
Slower.
Pip slows down. They walk around the table twice.
Call Estella.
Pip goes to the door of the room and shouts, Estella! Estella! Pip returns to Miss Havisham, and they continue to walk around the table. Estella comes in with Camilla, Sarah Pocket, Raymond, and Georgiana. They all look at Pip and Miss Havisham walking around the table.
How well you look, dear Miss Havisham. I do not. I am old and yellow. I look terrible.
Poor Miss Havisham. How could anybody expect you to look well?
How are you, Camilla?
Thank you, Miss Havisham. I am well but tired. I lie awake at night because I am anxious about you.
Then don't think about me.
I cannot help it. My legs jerk in the night. Raymond will tell you.
Camilla begins to cry. Everybody knows that you are so anxious about Miss Havisham that one of your legs is becoming shorter than the other.
Thinking about somebody does not mean that you are their best friend. No, indeed it does not. Thinking is easy.
Yes, I know. I am weak to think so much about her. I wish I could stop. It makes me suffer such a lot. Sometimes I think about Matthew. He never comes to see her at all. Nobody thanks me for lying awake at night and thinking about him.
I should think not. Who did you expect to thank you, my dear?
I did not expect thanks.
Camilla begins to cry again.
Matthew will come and see me when I am lying on this table.
She hits the table with her stick.
That will be his place, and yours will be there.
She hits the table again, in a different place, for each of the following people.
And your husband Raymond's will be there. And Sarah Pocket's will be there. And Georgiana's will be there.
She looks at the group of people angrily.
Now you all know your place. Now go. Pip, walk me. Walk me.
Yes, Miss Havisham. Pip and Miss Havisham begin to walk around the table again. The others all begin to leave. Camilla is still crying and blows a kiss to Miss Havisham. Raymond helps her to go. Georgiana leaves next and says nothing.
Bless you, Miss Havisham, dear.
Sarah leaves as well.
Estella, help them down the stairs.
Estella follows the others.
Today is my birthday, Pip.
Happy...
I don't allow anyone to speak of it. They all come here, but they do not dare to say anything about it. It was on my birthday many years ago that this cake came here. It has been here ever since. The cake and I have grown old together. The mice and spiders destroy the cake, and time destroys me.
Pip and Miss Havisham continue to walk around the table until Estella comes back into the room.
Pip, you will play cards with Estella.
Yes, Miss Havisham. Estella has some cards. She sits on the floor with Pip, and they begin to play. Miss Havisham watches them.
I win. You are not a very good player. Come on, boy. We will play again.
They play another game.
He has very rough hands, this boy. Look at his clothes. He is common.
Pip looks very unhappy and almost cries. He tries to hide his hands from Estella, but he is playing cards and cannot hide them.
I win again, boy. He is not very clever. He is very stupid, this common boy.
You do not say anything about her, Pip. What do you think of her?
I don't want to say.
Then tell me in my ear.
She bends down so that Pip can speak into her ear.
Well, what do you think of her?
I think she is very proud, and very pretty, and very rude.
Anything else?
I think I would like to go home.
And not see her again, although she is so pretty?
I don't know if I want to see her again, but I would like to go home now.
Play one more game first, and then you can go.
Pip and Estella play cards again.
I win again. Come, boy. I will give you something to eat and drink.
Goodbye, Miss Havisham.
You will come again in 6 days.
Estella and Pip leave the room.